Good morning, everybody. I was going to tell you some logistical things, but I think Chris covered most of the important stuff. I will remind you that there are the overflow rooms upstairs, 204 and 205, I believe, pretty much right one flight above us, which you might want to give a try if you get a little congested in here, because I know we have more people registered than we actually have seats in here, so you might want to do that. And you're allowed to take food and stuff in there. I know you will take food in here, but you're allowed. It's easier for me because I don't have to pretend I don't see it when you go up there. So, and I will remind you to look in the program. There's a lot of good information in there. Chris told you about where you can find the Slido information. Also on that page is how to get on the Wi-Fi, which you want to do, so you don't burn out your phone or laptop battery down here submitting Slido questions. So do that. You'll also, in the program, there's a link to full biographies of the speakers, which you might want to use because every moderator has their own approach, but I do very concise introductions. And so because I figure most of the people on our program are pretty well known to most of the people in the audience. So no need for long introductions, but if you want more information, you can get it through the link in the program. All right. You all seem sufficiently welcomed, so I think I'll start us on the first session of the day. Our first two talks, in theory, will mesh together very tightly. So I think I am going to try to introduce our two speakers. I'll introduce them jointly. We'll see how this works. We're going to start with Craig Childs and Patty Limerick. And I'll introduce them together, not only because their talks hopefully will mesh together, but they're in many respects, they're very similar people. They're both very accomplished authors. Both are passionate about the history of this region. Both share the belief that the management issues that dominate current discourse in this basin and that will be the primary focus of the next 2 days. Those are just one point in a long timeline that goes back several centuries and hopefully goes forward several centuries as well. So we're going to start with a little perspective of we're just one point in time here. If you haven't read either of Craig's or Patty's books, I guess the place to start with Craig would be House of Rain, at least in terms of the sort of things he's going to talk about today. And for Patty, I always go back to the Legacy of Conquest, which I guess you could say that made her famous. She said, and it's again that touches on a lot of the issues that I expect her to cover today as well. Again, after they both talk, we'll have them both field questions jointly. You don't need to wait till they're done to start submitting questions. So when you hear a question, go ahead and type it in, and it'll be in the queue. And so when we get to that point, we'll be ready to go. So I think I covered everything. Craig, you ready to go? All right, knock 'em dead.
I'm sure you noticed that the Flatirons are being hugged by clouds right now, and that outside you can still smell the rain from last night, which is a blessed smell. If anybody in this landscape, you probably all understand the thin thread of precipitation that we hang by. So the smell of it means so much. The touch of rain means everything here. Here being the dry west, from here down into Mexico through the Great Basin Desert, the Colorado Plateau, the Mojave, the Chihuahua, the Sonora. I am born in Tempe, Arizona, home of the Salt River Project, where on the days that groundwater is being pumped, the city smells different from the days that the Salt River is being accessed. You know water in different places. You know how water smells, how water tastes. There is a relationship with water we have here that nobody has anywhere else because it is water of this place. My family is from across New Mexico, so my generations here are small. My knowledge of this landscape is anecdotal, but I've tasted that water. I drink off of the ground. I drop to my knees at holes in the sandstone and I drink right out of it because it matters where you drink. It matters the water that enters your body. There's an old saying, a rhyme that everybody in this room knows that you've probably said before, and I'm a little hesitant to say it out loud because it is potentially offensive. It is, I've talked to indigenous people in the Southwest about this in particular and have been told, oh, we don't say that out loud. And I understand it, so I'm going to just say it here anecdotally. This rhyme is, rain, rain, go away, come again another day. You never, ever tell rain to go away. And I appreciate the come again another day part of it, the inviting it back, but it's the go away. This is not something that is said. I was, back in 2020, I was interviewing over the phone a Zuni weaver who weaves the rain sashes for dances in the summer, and we were having conversations throughout the summer. It was during lockdown, so everything had to happen by phone, and we were just checking in with each other, calling each other and going, so how's the sky looking down there? Because I live in Southwest Colorado, between Telluride and the Utah border, and so we just call back and forth, and I would say nothing's going on up here. It's a smoke light from wildfires, that coppery light, and I remember him saying, there's nothing going on down here. They're just two little clouds that are moving across the sky, and that one reminds me of my uncle. And I asked, what do you mean it reminds you of your uncle? And he said, well, my uncle spends a lot of time at sheep camp and doesn't really come in for the ceremonies. And he and his friends go out, that's him and his friend walking. And he is not, those clouds are not going to bring us rain. And my uncle, he doesn't come in for the ceremony, so he's not part of the cultural apparatus that is working on rain. So that's my uncle up there. And so I was just like, I've spent so much time in the desert looking at clouds going, who are you? Do you have rain? Are you bringing it here? And there's some times that I've been out there, pounding my chest and howling and going, come on, you can do it, bring rain. And it generally doesn't happen. And I think it might be all the shouting that I do, that maybe I need to be quieter. And later that summer, a huge thunderstorm system hit in northern New Mexico, and I called him right after that, and he said, farm plots were erased, roads were destroyed, houses have ankle deep mud inside of them. And I said, did you ever think about asking it not to rain when it's so destructive? And he said, never. He said, you'd never, ever say that, which is why I don't say rain, rain, go away. When I hear somebody say it, I go, shh. No, just in case this matters, in case this puts any weight on it, we need the rain to stay. We need the rain to come. My anecdotal knowledge of water here is fairly elemental. I follow the rain from place to place. I pay attention to the last time it rains because that determines how far I can walk, how many days or weeks across the ground, because I'm depending on the rain that is filled up in the water pockets in what we call kissing pools, those shallow pockets in sandstone where you tip your head down and you kiss them and you drink. I look to older ways of understanding water in this landscape. I look to my friend, the weaver at Zuni, and because his family has been on the Colorado Plateau for probably 1,500, 2,000 years, maybe longer. And that kind of knowledge, I think it takes that long. I think it takes thousands of years of being in a place, which I look at how we deal with policy and water law now, and I go, well, we need another few thousand years. Can we get there? I walk around out there and I find signs everywhere of people who have moved through and will move back and continue to move back over thousands of years. You find pieces of pottery on the ground that tell stories of families and lineages, how water was used in this place. Everything is water. Everything is rain. Every piece of pottery broken that you find on the ground is there because it rains. And when it doesn't rain, people go somewhere else. I guess that's the difference now. The cities that we build don't really move. They stay in place. And when I look back at 1,000 years ago, I walk in the canyons and find cliff dwellings, granaries, masonry structures, an incredible amount of work that has gone into some of these sites where you see 3-story towers built up in the rocks, entrances that are T-shaped or rectangular into rooms with timbered ceilings, handprints, fingerprints in the mortar, 1,000 years old. It wasn't that long ago. The movement up to the cliff dwellings, that corresponded with a drought that is equivalent to the one we're in right now in duration and intensity. The last time a drought of this magnitude has been in the Southwest. And I see these cliff dwellings and I can see the process. I can see that for centuries, people were living down lower in great houses, dry land farming, larger populations in the Four Corners than live there now, a very occupied, lived in place. And when I hear the word abandoned, talking about the abandonment of the Four Corners or parts of the Colorado Plateau, and it's an odd word because people have always moved in this landscape, and using the word abandon is like saying your house was abandoned when you went to work in the morning. You came back at the end of the day. Nothing was abandoned. When I talk to people at Hopi, at Zuni, we talk about ancestral landscapes, the maps that Jemez is in one place now, but it was people moved there from another place. This is the nature of this landscape, is motion. Droughts keep us in motion, have always kept people in motion. And when people moved to cliff dwellings, it was during such a drought. And so there was a lot of conflict, violence, migration. It was upheaval. But that's not an unfamiliar thing in the Southwest. Upheaval happens when it gets drier. In fact, that's found worldwide, that periods of drought are associated with periods of conflict. And I've listened to archaeologists argue about this back and forth about whether this is an environmental issue or a social issue. And it's so interesting that we break things into these different pieces where environmental issues are social issues. Rain is survival. No rain can be violent. It can upheave lives. People moved up into cliff dwellings to get away from that, moving into defensive positions in canyons and out on mesa edges where there's only one pinch point to get out there. And then there are structures, masonry structures, 800, 900 years old, built all around the edges of these mesas. And the curious thing is most of these cliff dwellings were only lived in for 20 to 30 years. And it was an incredible outlay. I mean, look at Cliff Palace in Mesa Verde, that these enormous structures were built, but they were lived in for such a short period of time because that drought did not let up. what happened is there were centuries of abundant water, of good growing that led up to this moment. So you had a large population, you had big infrastructure, great houses, and people living in these spread out pit house structures, but also these multi-story. Have you been to Chaco Canyon and see what that era produced? 5-story walls on a single building that has a 2-acre footprint, 800 or more rooms, kivas throughout. This was big stuff that was happening here. And drought took it down. It wasn't abandoned. People moved to the next place and to the next place. That is how you live in this landscape. Departures and returns. When I see these sites, these ancient sites, I think, oh, these will be occupied again. These are part of an old memory. When the time is right, people will be here, which is why I don't pick up pottery on the ground and take it with me, because those are all signs. I've been out with archaeologists, Hopi archaeologists, looking at sites where they look down on the ground and they see the decorations on the pottery and they say, no, this was somebody else's place. And then the next day we're at a different location, at a different cliff dwelling, and they look at pottery and go, yes, that's us. That is my clan. That is my group. That's my history there. These are all remembered places, and the rain is remembered when it was here and when it wasn't. I was talking to my friend Jim Minot, who is a traditional farmer at Zuni and a scientist scholar, and we were looking at rock art. And he said that the petroglyphs that are really cleanly defined on the wall, just a really precise work, he said those make him happy because those are times of abundance. And then looking at petroglyphs that are more quickly done, an animal that isn't quite finished, that doesn't have its back legs, or that I used to think, oh, these might have been done by children. They were just testing it out. His take on it was, no, these were hard times. And he said, these make me sad. These were times when there wasn't that much water. And yet people still came to record on the rock, whatever it is, the story they were telling, even if it was roughly done, even if it was times of warfare, times of migration, they left a mark. But you can see in the rock imagery the different time scales, the water times, the dry times, the departures, the returns. I've been on excavations around the Four Corners where trenching down into a site, you're going through hundreds of years of occupation, and then you get to sterile ground, but then keep digging down and, oh, there's another site underneath this. And then you dig under that, and there's another site beneath that. And sometimes they're 300 or 400 years apart, which says that people have been moving out and back and out and back. And sometimes it's 700 years between one occupation and another. So when I look at these sites now, I go, oh, 700 years hasn't passed yet. Who knows what's going to happen next? What droughts will come in here? I think the cautionary tale of looking back at the history of the Southwest and the indigenous history is, the caution is not to pay attention to it. If you don't pay attention, you won't know how to live in this place. I learn that this place is about motion, is about paying attention to the rain. When I talked to this Zuni weaver, we were talking about how to bring the rain, and in our first conversation, he said, make noise. When it's raining, bring it on. Match the thunder. Pound on something, sing, dance, make noise, and it wasn't raining. It wasn't raining all summer, and it was 2020 was a tough summer, and I called him and I said, yeah, I'm out there. I've got this gong and I'm banging on it, and nothing's happening. And he said, oh no, you gotta wait for it to come. Don't bang on your gong or you'll scare it away. And he said, I have to tell you this in a little bit more detail. He said, when the storm comes, you've got to be quiet. Said when his 11-year-old grandson would come inside and say, there's a thunderstorm coming, he would go, shh, be really quiet. And then when it starts to rain, start making noise. Then when the thunder comes, match the intensity of the thunder. He said when the dances happen in the summer at Zuni and it rains during the dances, the drums are just flying, the feet are pounding, rain is splashing. You're making so much noise because the sky is making noise. You're matching the sky. And when the rain starts to let off, you quiet down. And then when it's gone, you're not making noise anymore. And I realized, oh, this is a very different way of treating the rain that I've been thinking. Because I've been thinking, come on, bring it on. And instead it's, no, be quiet until it comes. You've got to match the rise and fall. We do not make rain. We obey the rain. And that's what I've learned from walking out here, from walking thousands of miles across the Southwest, that everything hinges on the rain. Every decision you make. This is sacred. The rain, you can still smell it outside. The ground is still damp. The clouds are hugging the flat irons. This is a blessing. And what you say is thank you. Thank you for listening.
All right, Patty. Patty, come on down. You're the one person I can spot in this room without any trouble, Patty. I've known Patty for probably 25 years or so, been when we were both teenagers. Is that fair? Oh, we're gonna have to find a microphone for that.
Oh, I'm gonna go over there.
Yeah, I know, but for a Q&A part. Yeah, come on up. You don't get a second introduction, so no. Patty's a person that needs no introduction and will get no introduction.
Actually, someone did that once a few years ago and said, this person does not need an introduction. And then I spoke for a while, and the first question from the audience was, who are you? So, okay. So what a pleasure to be here. I'm so grateful to the organizers and to all the attendees and to all the people in the room with whom I feel like I've been hanging out since we were in elementary school. I guess that's the timetable. Really grateful. I'm so grateful for the title, Turning Hindsight into Foresight. That's a phrase that sums up what I've been trying to do for the last 40 or so years of my life of applied history, bringing historical perspective to bear on contemporary issues. And I will say that an essential corollary to that project is anti-fatalism. It is focused in lots of ways on the contingency in the past. It didn't have to come out this way. We do not have to feel that we are riding a moving sidewalk, just going on to the next thing. We actually have an enormous amount of choice. If humans made structures, social and cultural and political structures, they can change those. So this brings me to a very silly story that I was very young. I went for the first time to a conference. I'd never been to a conference. And I was seated at a table at a banquet with a bunch of adults. And we had a speaker who was very lively, really funny. And I was like 20 years old, and I thought, well, at some point we'll get to a topic. Well, he spoke for half an hour or so, and then we laughed at a lot of things, and then he sat down. And I said to the adults, what was his topic? I seem not to have got his topic. They said, oh, he doesn't have a topic. He's an inspirational speaker. So I thought that was really weird, and then I turned into one. So that's a paradox. Young people, beware paradox, because that comes at you. So, all righty. So what I want to do is I want to say a little about what Doug asked me to do. He said, one thing he said in his first message is, we'd like you to talk about the Western settlement of the 1800s and 1900s. don't be frightened. I think I figured out a way to do this that will not invade the time allotted to all the other speakers. Like I can do that. He also, what I'm basically doing is telling some stories. That's not the first time I tried that strategy. Fables, parables, case studies, I don't know quite what to call them. They're sort of like inspiration from Aesop. Aesop would tell a story and then say what the moral of the story was. So I'm kind of following in his steps, though I'm much less artful, I suppose, than Aesop was with those tales. But I would also like to say another part of Doug's instructions to me was that I should reckon with all the laws, the accumulation of laws, rules, regulations, procedures, and bad customs like the exclusion of tribes from the start of the, from the Colorado River Compact. I should do all that, and I should then look at those as forces that have boxed the modern Colorado River community into a cage, legal, economic, cultural, that's proving hard to escape. So people who know me will know that he gave me a great opportunity with that, because he said that I should set the stage by talking, that was the opening remark, I should set the stage by talking about this long history, and then I should chart a route out of a cage that all these laws might make us feel that we were in a cage. So stage and cage to a person whose last name is Limerick. Doug asked me to set the stage and to find a route out of the cage. I have done what I can to cook up a plan, move into a hope-infused age. Thank you. My co-author over here, there's my co-author who gave me stage and lots of sage. I wasn't going to use sage. That was not too much. So, okay. So reckoning with hope is a large part of what I'm trying to do here. And what I want to do is to start with is take on, just put forward two giant generalizations, which I think are accurate, which few giant generalizations are about the 19th century and the 20th century, and of course for the centuries before that. But I want to start by concentrating on the year 2026, which is a topic on many minds here, because that is when the revisions to the Colorado Compact are due, 2026. Well, 2026 is a year that is going out of its way to call attention to itself. 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Everyone knows that. 2026 is the 150th anniversary of Colorado's statehood. It is the 150th anniversary of the founding of the University of Colorado. And here are two more round number, somewhat less noticed metric moments, but arguably more relevant to us today than those other ones. 2026 is the 110th anniversary of the report by U.S. Geological Survey engineer E.C. LaRue, a report in which E.C. LaRue argued for a lower estimate of the annual flow of the Colorado. Thanks to Eric Kuhn and to John Fleck, who I think are here now, so thank you, wherever you are. We learned about LaRue's descending estimate of the Colorado River's hydrography, and we know that LaRue's more conservative calculations would have been available to the commissioners who negotiated the Colorado River Compact in 1922. E.C. LaRue left a heritage that should be on our minds in 2026 with a historical lesson that is a clear action plan. When we are making assumptions, as the Colorado Compact negotiators were about how much water flowed in the Colorado, when we are making assumptions, when we are deferring to conventional wisdom, when we are moving ahead to create a plan that rests on calculations that could use a more critical appraisal, we can think of E.C. LaRue's 1916 report, and we can contemplate the interesting fact that he actually tried to contact Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, who presided over the negotiations that led to the 1922 Compact. He tried to say, you want to think about how much water is actually in that river. So what is the practical historical lesson of this story? We should from time to time pause and ask ourselves, is there a latter-day counterpart to E.C. LaRue to whom we should be paying attention? Is there someone among us who has scrupulously acquired data, analyzed that data, and arrived at a conclusion that calls into question premises we were taking for granted? I won't put the group on the spot this particular moment here, but I won't conceal the fact that I was and am tempted to ask if there is an E.C. LaRue seated here. Is there a counterpart? Is that person among us? Or even several E.C. LaRues? And I think coming to my first generalization, big generalization in a moment, you'll see I know where that population might come from. So are you in the room? But what I will suggest is that we use the coffee breaks and lunches to see if we can find those folks, the E.C. LaRue counterparts. So now I want to shift to another 2026 anniversary, which I'm sure I will be the only person on the planet who will notice, but then you'll have to join me on that. 2026 is the bicentennial of fur trapper Jedediah Smith's failed effort to find the Buenaventura River. The Buenaventura River is a river that should have existed. If you had grown up on the East Coast, you might think that it existed because lots of rivers flow from sort of the interior into the Atlantic. So the Buenaventura was a river, a total wish fulfillment river that should have happened. And it was going to go from the interior of the West straight to the Pacific coast. It's a really good idea. And its flaw is kind of evident. But people kept talking about the Buenaventura River, and fur trapper Jedediah Smith actually did a kind of circuit of the Great Basin in hopes of finding that river, which he was unsuccessful in doing. Now, this is hindsight. Hindsight is not worth much, but what an opportunity Jedediah Smith had. Fur trappers actually did have kind of a public audience. If he could only have, he gave the Buenaventura River a chance to exist. Didn't happen. So here's the unfair hindsight observation. He could have made a lasting, powerful statement to his nation. He, like a number of his successors, had acquired essential knowledge from hard travels. He knew that the American West was not going to provide the kind of rivers that Euro-Americans wanted, and he could have shared that finding with his fellow Americans, counseling them to modify and moderate their expectations for the workings of water in the West, and most important, to recognize the wisdom in reducing their confidence and their certainty that the West was going to comply with these unrealistic expectations. So Jedediah Smith could have done that. He didn't. It took, 20 years later that John C. Fremont did the circuit again and really had to say, that river is not going to come to our aid here. We're going to have to go without it. So, but that brings me to another person that I would like to call out from the past. It's unfair, but a historical figure who does not deserve hindsight regret in some ways, but does in others. Joseph Christmas Ives, who was the first lieutenant in the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers. In 1858, I believe he had an even better opportunity to advise his fellow citizens to constrain their ambitions and aspirations, to moderate their arrogance and overconfidence when they thought about the rivers of the West. So does anybody know him, Joseph Christmas Ives? 1, 2, 3. Well, you lucky people, you heard from, no, you already knew about it. I talked to Craig about him, but you already knew, so, okay. So the rest of you are in for a very amusing experience here. Just as Ives was certainly in for, I'm not sure he got a little bit around to being amused. So Joseph Christmas Ives got an interesting mission. He was to build a steamboat, and he was to go to the mouth of the Colorado, and he was to take the steamboat up the river. Told you this would be pretty funny. And he grew up in New York. So the poor man, I mean, the Hudson, he thinks of rivers, and he thinks, well, Hudson. So he got his steamboat built. He started up the river, and that was not a very comfortable run for him. So I just have to read his words because they're so spectacular. So he's fairly, but it's taking him a long time. We'll just say it's taking him a long time because they run aground every few minutes. It's pretty funny. So the bluffs of the desert come to the brink of the river, but below this confined passage is a stretch of several miles, which we call the Sand Island Shoals, where the Colorado is divided by islands into numerous channels, and the navigation is more difficult than any yet experienced. That's pretty funny because there had never been anything but difficulty on that. One bark would scarcely be passed before another would be encountered, and we went 3 days in accomplishing a distance of 9 miles. The ascent of the river under the circumstances promises to be a tedious business. Now, I need to back up and say this was supposed to be a demonstration of American power to the Native people. Okay. This slow progress and the long detentions, though dull enough for us, have been a source of intense satisfaction and fun to the spectators on the banks. Well, you're not supposed to laugh at your own jokes, but I guess you can laugh at somebody else while you're reading someone else's words. I suppose that's right. So, okay. Our sharp-witted friends, the Chemehueves, seem to have exclusive possession of the upper end of the valley. If we had anticipated inspiring them with awe or admiration, we should be sadly disappointed, for they regard our method of ascending the river with unaffected contempt. They have been demonstrating how vastly inferior our mode of locomotion is to theirs. They can foot it on the shore or pole along a raft upon the river without interruption, and that we should spend days in doing what they can accomplish in half as many hours strikes them as unaccountably stupid. The gleeful consciousness of superiority, at all events, keeps them in an excellent humor. When we reached the Sand Island shoals, as usual, they were awaiting the approach of the steamer at points opposite to the bars. At first, our troubles occasioned them unqualified delight. They watched the boat with breathless eagerness as we tried in vain to get through one place after another, and every time she ran aground, a peal of laughter would ring from the bank. But after a while, our mishaps appeared to move their compassion, and some one of them would run ahead and point out to our captain the part of the bar that had the greatest depth upon it, which their frequent fording of the stream often enabled them to know. So, who knew that river? So Ives had a great chance to address his nation and to say, oh, we need to rethink this. By the way, just close to the mouth of the Black Canyon, he said, just through, and walked overland to get out of there. So Ives did not say to his nation, you'll want to know this about the West. The rivers are not what we had in mind. We think we're going to assert power over them. That's not coming off. He did not do that. Why? Well, he chose not to do that, but he also, though you have to say his timing was not good. His report came out in 1861, so the Civil War is starting, and river explorations in the West are not going to be compelling. Plus, he made a bad choice, several bad choices, we know that, but he made a bad choice and fought with the Confederacy. So his chances of being a credible witness were zero at a certain point. So, but still, it is very striking to think that the message that we have from Ives was expectations needed some really careful thought, and maybe even some surrender of those expectations. Now that is what I want to shift now to the, oh, well, I have to add this. With the recognition among many Indigenous people and also a number of people who've been shaped and influenced by not Native themselves are picking that up, that rivers are entities. Rivers are entities with character, with defined rights. If that's the case, they clearly have the right to make fun of us. And it is obvious that in 1858, in collaboration with the Chemehuevi people, the Colorado River had a good laugh at Euro-American arrogance and overconfidence. Moreover, the Colorado River said to the American government in terms that would be weighty at the time, but in the future, if you think this is a navigable river, you'll have to think again. So the notion of rivers really having a good time making fun, we just have to take a moment on that. But now we're going to get to two very big generalizations and reflect on those and see what I think is promise and reasons for hopeful collaboration. I guess what I'm thinking, I did not expect to reach this conclusion, but this is a pretty good time to be looking at those 2026 revisions of the Colorado River Compact. Because I think the two historical patterns that I'm going to speak of are, it's possible to reckon with those patterns, and the reckoning is already, I would say, pretty well advanced. I would say very well advanced. So, okay, so first giant generalization is that the failure to recognize the presence and rights of Native people is a catastrophe that can never be forgotten. And if you want to look, say you have some people who are not as aware of that as they should be, there's no better place to go than Article 7 of the Colorado River Compact. I quote, "Nothing in this compact shall be construed as affecting the obligations of the United States of America to Indian tribes." that is mystifying timing. For an historian who do kind of like chronology, I think, what got into those guys? 1908, the Supreme Court, Winter's Doctrine. Tribes have reserved water rights tied directly to the time of the creation of their reservations. 1908, Winter's Doctrine. 1922, we're not talking about that. What's wrong with law school in those days? Well, they didn't go, many of them hadn't gone to law school and just, but what a wild act of chronology to do that. Well, okay, so now that is the one demonstration of millions of what happens when you lose sight of the presence, the rights, the continued significance of Indian people. And when you lose sight of the lesson that Joseph Christmas Ives had, at least for a few moments, Indian peoples demonstrate that there are innumerable ways for human beings to live with the Colorado River. There's not, you must always have a steamboat. There certainly isn't that. There's just so many options. And to cut off the recognition of all those options was certainly damaging to Indian people and deeply disrespectful, but also a handicap to aspirations and ambitions among Euro-Americans. I'll just put that forward as my own thought. Plus, losing sight of what you would think every living human being would know, that without water, you die. That doesn't take enormous experience in life to know that. You know that. So to be with people who recognize that as a sacred proposition, not just an unhappy, unfortunate utilitarian reality of human existence, but see it as sacred, to cut that off was to cut off an option of perspective that would enrich and deepen human conduct. So that is the reason why I see optimism in this. That's over. Article 7. It's gone. Did I miss the memorial service for it? I would have liked to have been at that. That is not holding weight. That's really an extraordinary reckoning with a historical heritage, that simply cannot be brought back to life. And we can wonder about what happened to the winners' rights notions, but we know that's gone. Is it as gone as it should be? I will not say that, but it's reduced. It is so significantly reduced. And the notion of having gatherings of this sort, well, that's madness if we did not have tribal folks so fully represented here. So, okay, so that's my first cheery remark with my overgeneralization. My second overgeneralization is that, well, I guess I want to accent that this is, as we worry about the complexity of modifying the Colorado River Compact next year, 2026, we could just take a deep breath and think it's already pretty damn modified. With Article 7 losing its weight, becoming outmoded, it's pretty modified. Now I'm going to go to one more thing, which I think is also a place where the attitudes that govern the compact are also quite well modified. So this brings me back to Ives and to a massive generalization that beginning with Spanish explorers and continuing west into the 20th century, in the minds of the great majority of Euro-Americans, the Colorado River was the opposite of what a river should be. The Colorado defied expectations imported from other parts of the planet, and variations of this defiance was manifested in nearly all of the rivers in the arid and semi-arid West. In the minds of people whose definition of the right kind of river took shape in the eastern United States or in Europe, they knew what a river should be. A river should be a substantial flow of water through a gently tilted landscape in a way that made its water available to support and be accessible for ambition and aspiration of settlers. That's what a river should be. Depending on where you encountered it, the Colorado River had quite a bit of water, but it was very inconveniently placed. So it was going to take an enormous amount of ingenuity, federal money, determination, labor, and most of all, confidence in the human ability to take charge and prevail over physical reality. It's going to take all of that to force these Western rivers to behave like proper rivers. Boosters may have portrayed the West as a land of endless opportunity, but the Colorado River made a very clear statement that the boosters were overstating the case. And finding opportunities at any scale was going to take a lot of work. So here's the promising pair of questions I'm bringing up with this historical generalization. Was something wrong with the West rivers, or was something wrong with the mindsets and assumptions carried into the West by Euro-Americans? So action plan is pretty clear. It involves kind of cognitive chiropractic adjustments. Never been to a chiropractor, don't know what I'm talking about exactly, but I think they do that kind of stuff. Well, let's not talk about it because it could be painful to think about. So in any case, chiropractic adjustment. When we fully recognize the differences between rivers in the eastern part of North America and rivers in the western part of North America, we can then reconfigure the relationship of human beings to western rivers in ways that would work for the benefit of both the rivers and the whole spectrum of human beings. So that is my cheery, lucky yes. Now, I did not pay as close attention. I know you were not quite on schedule, so how much more time do I have? I don't have many time. Ooh, boy, okay, good. Never say that kind of thing to me. No, it's great. I abide carefully by that. So, and here is an excellent limerick that I wrote quite a while ago that sort of anticipated the notion of changing ideas here. The West left settlers aghast. It was dry, it was rugged, it was vast. They thought water was the trigger for making towns bigger, an idea whose time is now past. So, okay, so now a few, actually that is not, clapping because you think I'm going to stop there. No. Because I have one little thing I want to do, which is about humor. And humor as an essential key to getting out of the cage. That, well, sometimes when we reckon with a historical legacy, we can be brought to a halt by that and feel paralyzed by the intensity of that inheritance from the people who made decisions in the past. That is not historically sound to see this as inevitable. I've already said that is my primary thing here. So I would say that we can do all kinds of things that will loosen that, well, we'll just dissolve that cage. But I will say that I don't think you can do that without humor. And I would like to turn to Mark Twain, who was pretty good. He did say reprehensible things about pie people. I recognize that, but I'm still going to say that Mark Twain did have a sense of humor that I can't resist, even as I'm just something we have to do with these white folks of the past. We just have to sometimes shudder over some of their conduct, and then every once in a while just find them entertaining in ways that make us regret having given that much to them. So, okay, so Mark Twain was really good when it came to making fun of things. And one of the things that he did that was really great was the way he mocked Western rivers. And he conveys these attitudes almost perfectly. He said that the Humboldt River, he said, was such a silly little river that there was no better exercise than to jump back and forth over it and then drink it dry. He said that there was the Platte River, when they were in a coach, Platte River, it was so shallow and there was so much quicksand that he thought he had avoided the terrors of the sea all his life in order to be shipwrecked on the plains. So, okay, so Mark Twain said a number of things that were very funny that convey that enormously widespread sense that there's something wrong with Western rivers. So he did that. But he is also very famous, and this actually will be my conclusion. So he's very famous. I think for decades, every time I went to a Western Water Conference, some speaker would say, instead of just saying, I'm through talking now, which is what I'll do in a minute, they would say, well, you know, it's what Mark Twain said, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. So they would say that. And it was always a moment where I thought, that's not particularly witty. And Twain is really witty, and that he seemed to have had a bad day there. So it turns out the people at the Mark Twain papers have tried, in Berkeley, have tried to find that quotation, and they can't find it. That doesn't mean that he never said it, because we all have said things we thought, oh, that didn't come out right, so he might have said it. But it's just goofy that that has been so built into Western water conferences. Recognize it's a statement of inevitability. We always fight. That's what we do. So here is my rewrite of the line that Mark Twain apparently didn't say. If Mark Twain had said it, and if he were around with us in these times, he would have said, you can still go ahead and say whiskey is for drinking, I have no quarrel with that. But whiskey is for drinking, and water is for brewing coffee to be served at stakeholder meetings, where good-hearted people with many different relationships to water gather to see if they can sort through their assumptions and decide what they can agree on, what they can almost agree on, what they can adapt so it is more susceptible. So whiskey is for drinking and water is for brewing coffee, or I suppose other beverages could come into this, but for stakeholder meetings, just as we go through all these issues of what will happen in 2026 and these compact revisions, think about that rewritten Mark Twain line. And the next time you see Mark Twain quoted as having said something that just seems like a flat, silly, unmoving thing to say, think, I bet he didn't say that. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, Patty, have a seat there. And Craig, why don't you come on out? We are going to transition to audience questions. So hopefully you've been sending a few questions in. I'm told there's not a lot of questions coming in. So start sending those questions in. And now we have a microphone now for our panelists. So, Patty, before we start, I have to say, if I had any idea you were going to read my musings about what you should talk about so carefully, I would have given you more than a half-baked idea of what to do. Congratulations. I think it's at least 2/3 baked at this point. So I think that was progress. So thank you for doing that. Jason, or do we have some questions we can get started with? Or all right. So we're going to. Jason up here will send you questions.
I have to interrupt him and argue with him. He gave me the key words for a pretty good limerick. And I'm supposed to be discontented?
I think Nantucket was in my email and you didn't use it. But
Well, with cage and stage, rage is always sitting there. It's always underneath.
Shenanigans. Hi, folks. Good morning. I'm Jason Robinson, teach water law up at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. I'll be working with my colleague, Celine Hawkins, to serve as a facilitator, both today and tomorrow. And by facilitation, really what's meant is there's bright, engaged people here and bright, engaged people there, and we want to facilitate a conversation so that it's not a vibe where it's just people talking at you from the front, but it's actually iterative, right? And there's some dialogue back and forth. So what Doug mentioned earlier about putting questions in Slido really means a lot, because that's the content that we're going to draw off in trying to make the conversation happen. So please do make an effort to throw your ideas into the Q&A in Slido, and Celine and I will serve as kind of curators to present those ideas to the folks at the front of the room, again, both today and tomorrow. So pleasure to be with you, and we'll start off with one question that came in concerning a topic that I know I came across as a professor a few times when reading the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, right? And for those of you who are familiar with that document, you have in it a lot of really brilliant or earth-changing, game-changing concepts, but one of them is free, prior, and informed consent. FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. And so one of the questions was for Craig, and it had to do with consent. And it sounds like some folks in the audience were thinking about your storytelling and the sharing of stories that you kindly offered, and just your process for going about getting consent, obtaining consent in a respectful way when you're on, say, Dene homeland or Zuni homeland, and then bring those stories back here.
Yeah, for me, consent comes in different ways. There's the consent of actually being able to be there physically, which which I've walked, especially on the Navajo Nation, quite a bit, covered a lot of ground, and consent has come in different ways. There's the consent of just standing 50 feet away from a hogan and saying, hello, anybody home? Here's what I'm doing. Do you need me to head back or keep going? Or and then when I think consent for taking a story and putting it in the world, what somebody has said, that's taken me decades. The people that I'm quoting now, I've been talking for 30 years to different people until I finally felt like I got to the right place where I understood how to, what I was allowed to say and what I wasn't, because sometimes I've been told way too much, I think out of politeness, and so I was always hesitant to publish what I was being told because I didn't know what I was allowed to or not. And ultimately, in the end, it's me sending the material that I've written back to somebody and saying, what am I allowed to use here? And please just tell me to cut it if anything here makes you uncomfortable, and how far, and do you want your name used? Do you not want your name used? And in what circles? So these are, when I wrote the book House of Rain, that was some time ago, and I didn't include that much indigenous perspective because it was more that I was hearing it and then going, okay, I'm not in a position to write that down. But then I wrote a book called Tracing Time just a few years ago that was much more involved in indigenous perspective, because I felt like, okay, now after 30 years of talking to people, I think I know how far I can go. So it's not consent as much as it is spending a lot of time listening and figuring out what you can say and what you can't say. It's not, I can't get a signature on a piece of paper for it. It's part of the conversation, which is hard if you're just coming in out of the blue, if you're a journalist who's just dropping in and saying, hi, can I have your permission to say this? I think it's a much deeper, longer relationship to get consent and get relationship.
Well, I want to express my endless gratitude for having had an office 2 doors away from Vine Deloria Jr. And he had a very robust sense of humor, and a good share of the time that humor, I gave him great opportunities for that humor. So from time to time, I would quote things that Vine had said. In fact, I think he would be fine about my telling him this. When I was having a calamity, my husband had a stroke. Vine helped me out and was really kind to me. And he wanted to take Jeff Limerick out to lunch for the first time after Jeff's stroke. So I was very harried, and I took Jeff Limerick. Jeff could not drive. I took Jeff Limerick to the wrong restaurant. And I walked in, and I thought, I don't think this is working here. So I called another restaurant, and Vine was there. They said, yes, there's a gentleman here on his 6th cup of coffee. Oh, boy. So he came and joined us at the other one. So for the next years, every time I said to Vine, well, let's meet at 2 at whatever, he'd say, that's where you're telling me to go, Dr. Limerick. Which restaurant are you going to this time? So I told that story, and I'm sure with his consent, and here's a story that I was not able to tell him, that his memorial service was in Golden, and I could not attend because I had accepted a speaking invitation at the University of Portland. So I said I couldn't be there for the memorial. I went to the University of Portland. When I got there, they said, we have our Plains Indian class at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Would you mind coming and just speaking about Vine Deloria's career? I said, oh, I'd love to do that. Then I realized that the timing was precise. I was speaking in that class just as the memorial service was starting. And that's adjusting for the time change on that. And I thought, okay, I can hear it. Dr. Limerick, everybody else has gone to Golden, and you are giving a tribute to me in Portland, Oregon. So it's just, so I feel like the humor thing, I certainly would never say something that I thought was out there, but I don't know. I try to think as hard as I can about this. I don't think I ever put it much in writing. I guess that's one thing. And I don't think I really ever do it in a speech. I just did it, I guess, in a sort of speech. But I think what I wanted to say, this long way of getting there, on behalf of white people, expect white people to be clumsy as they participate in the full demolition of Article 7.
Thanks, Patty. Thanks, Greg. There's a question that relates to tribal sovereignty as well, but I'm going to table that one from now. I'm letting you all know I see it in the queue, but I want to jump to another one that I think touches on, Patty, part of what you said about LaRue, right? And telling us to look for the LaRues, right? And also the quote that I was never aware of, that Mark Twain said, water is for making coffee for stakeholder meetings. That was really amazing, the kind of how prescient he was, you know, Mark Twain. He wrote, it was out in Roughing It when he was out west. You heard that? No, the question along these lines is about collaboration. And if there are historical examples that you think are worth considering for scarcity driving collaboration, scarcity driven collaboration, good examples of those, and anything you might say about them.
Years ago, when there was once it's kind of a fairy tale, when there was a thriving center of the American West, we actually had a 2-day workshop with 8 or 9 historians, 10 historians, on times when scarcity of water had brought communities together and when it had heightened the tension. So we heard 10 very compelling presentations, and I think it would be inaccurate, I guess, to say it was 50-50. It was really interesting to see that sometimes water is so important that it's just not the time to fight. Fight later. In the meantime, make these arrangements that we all have to give up something in order to get something we really need and value. I think one of the things you could say for that is that needs and self-indulgent whims get sorted out fast with scarcity. And so much of the, well, to my knowledge, I have never heard when we say that water is absolutely essential for the lives we live in the West today, I have just never heard anyone even getting frail at going to a golf course that wasn't well watered. I just have never heard of anything where there's all the things we're taking for granted. Actually, water scarcity is anything but welcome to think, now we don't have to tend all that damn bluegrass. So I'm going to say it is sort of 50-50, that there are occasions, and some of them I will say are overland trail stories where people who don't look out for each other are asking for serious risk. Astounding stories from the overland trail of kindness and cooperation. The last part, the Humboldt Desert part, was unbearably tough, and the animals weren't up to pulling wagons with casks of water in them. There were tribal folks who came out on the trail carrying water to overland travelers, which is such an astoundingly generous thing to do. So anyway, I think there's such a mixture that I was really happy doing my big generalizations, and now I'm totally failing at saying anything except 2 routes open up: turn on each other and accomplish nothing, or say, I'm not the least bit enjoying your company, but I will have to work with you. And why don't we brew some coffee while we're doing it?
Very clever. Yeah, Craig, you said, I remember one of your comments, no rain can be violence or mean violence. And so, yeah, that aspect of your remarks seemed to.
Yeah, and maybe collaboration on a metaphorical level. I once mapped water holes near the Mexican border for the Cabeza Prieta Wildlife Refuge in Arizona, and I was depending on the water on these tiny little water holes out in this very dry place, and I found trails leading to them. There were ancient trails in the desert pavement on the ground, and a trail would go right through a saguaro, so you know it's been there for centuries, and these trails would converge into rock images and then a water hole there. And it felt like this collaboration over centuries, over thousands of years of people going, it's here. in case you don't know where you are, the water is over here. So we're talking across these distances where I see broken pottery, or I see seashells that have been carried in from the Sea of Cortez, and I go, okay, this is where your route is, and so there's this collaboration of showing each other over time where the water we need is, even if it's 10 gallons of water, and that's my kind of water, is the tiny amounts that are out there.
Thank you so much. Sorry about the mic issue. Next question. One of you, I think it was you, Patty, used the term booster. And I thought of Stegner, and then I thought of DeVoto before him, right? And then I thought of LaRue, and maybe it was the boosters who marginalized LaRue, but I don't know. That's pure speculation on my part. But that's a segue for a question of a feature of Euro-American settlement or colonization in Western North America that is kind of recurring and sometimes isn't broached when we're talking about water law and water policy. So I'll read the question with that context. Is it time to reckon with the religion of unbridled and continuous growth in the desert Southwest? And what can history do to inform that discussion?
Well, I'm going to go with this notion of rivers making fun of Euro-American ambitions. And I will say, if I were, well, once at a Halloween party, I dressed as a booster. This is 30 years ago, and I boosted I made a westward movement, and I was boosting Western Connecticut at the start, and so, and I just moved westward through the evening. I don't think anyone enjoyed my company in the least. I think it was probably at least, sorry, I resent the question for bringing that up, because that was a really silly way to spend Halloween. So where I'm struggling is that you brought up the boosters, and I have no reluctance to say that we need very forceful people, full of conviction, but capable of speaking persuasively to go through the transition we are going through. So when you were talking about that, I thought, can we repurpose boosters? Can we send them to camp and get them to get reoriented to better goals? Because there is something about booster energy, which is like, wow, that is apparently a renewable energy source. So how do we bring them? Well, I'm sorry to use Lyndon Johnson here, but he always did say that it's better to have people inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. So it's probably Lyndon Johnson's, just have some water issues, I guess, when you think about it. But I'm trying to think, and this is the old me of just like, there's going to be some alliance possible, even when it seems very unlikely. So the boosters have character traits that should be mobilized. Will we have their consent? Because in fact, that's a long period of growth that's what we do. And if we don't do it, everyone suffers, or the people we care about suffer. So to reverse that really requires some excellent define the odds energy, which I guess is what boosters often were doing. So you brought up the boosters, and now look what you've done here. Now you made me confess my stupid Halloween costume and so on.
Oh, and I even have a follow-up to that one, if I may. Greg, we have another one for you, but there's a question in the queue that dovetails really organically with that one, and it connects the boosterism thread, if you will, of that previous question with the Colorado River Compact. Patty, you mentioned Article 7 of the Colorado River Compact, but this question relates more to those flow obligations at Lee Ferry, and also those apportionments to the upper basin and the lower basin in Article 3A and 3B of the compact. That question's very germane to the state of Colorado, so the place where we're having this conference today. Question is, Patty, how can we help the upper basin states give up on an assumption that they can fully develop their 7.5 million acre feet compact allocation in the face of climate change?
Okay, so one of the great things about expanding our sense of time and fully attending to Native peoples is that those state borders just look goofy. They're so recent, and they're so strange. They're so square. It's just, really? That is going to be our unit of decision-making? These rectangles? That seems odd. They're so recent. Basins are also odd. Leaf Ferry, I don't think, is particularly designated by a creator as a, I said, maybe I missed that part of the, I'll go back to Genesis soon and see if I can find that. But okay, so it's funny that we have these configurations. And my personal proposal, if I ever had the privilege of convening the representatives who, a person I'm looking at knows well, the people who gather for representing the states to decide what's going to happen with the upper basin and the lower basin, the two things I would like to do there is begin with a comedian talking about how really silly these boundaries are and how funny. I mean, it's just funny that a line would be considered so significant, so arbitrary. The upper basin and the lower basin and the states in those are so arbitrary. But what I would do after that, I don't know if that would work very well. I'm not sure who the comedian, although I would certainly volunteer if I were given the chance on that. But I think more important would be what the historian could do. Because the historian, when I went to the Colorado River Water Users Association, especially last year or in December, I just thought, wait, this is an outcome of clear historical origin. In the mid-19th century, and extending really through the 19th century and into the 20th century, it was comparatively so much easier for white settlers to go to California and Arizona and settle in there. It was much harder to go into the Rockies and settle. So that is a historically generated fact that the population of the lower basin got huge long before the population of the upper basin, the white population, got really of any standing at all. So that's what what the two basins are thrown apart by, is that more people showed up in the lower basin long before a bunch of people showed up in the upper basin. So what do we do with that? Do we regret that? Do we condemn the people of the past for their lack of ability to go into arid or semi-arid high elevation farming? Is that what we should do? So it just seems like that's the time to just go, okay, that's the historical origin. That was not planned by any of us. We were not alive at the time. So that is a historical legacy that we're just going to have to deal with. And we can deal with it in rage at the injustice of those population disparities. That should never have happened. Arizona and California should never have, although I will say, I just have to say this, I think I wrote this at an Arizona water conference. Oh dear. When California, this was listening to the Arizona people, when California falls into the sea, its neighbors will shout out with glee. That state was our bane, causing trouble and pain, and now that it's gone, we are free. So I'm not going too far with the solidarity of Arizona and California after that. So, okay, so I just think this would be a great chance to at least try to play the historical card. This is a population imbalance that was unmistakable, and it is explicable why that happened. That's where the disproportion of who used water first came from. Can we just all go sit quietly and think about that and how we live with that legacy, and how I don't see any way to reverse that, that there were always people in Southern California long before there were people in Denver, for that matter. So, okay, so that's what I understand that's out of basin, but I was going to say Durango, but then Durango is still quite a bit smaller than the population of Southern California, so that didn't work out as an analogy. But I don't know, I would love to see what could happen with that. Just pretend you're undergraduates for half an hour, representatives of the upper basin and the lower basin, and see what that does to you, to actually have a historian lay out how you got to where you are and what would be a reasonable response to that disproportion.
Okay. Your busting out of that poem was amazing. Well done. The next question I have to honor, okay, because it's at the top of the queue, and we're engaging in some Athenian direct democracy here at today's conference, right? Yeah. This question relates to not the long view of history that each of you brings, but recent political history. So that's a transition. But I have to honor the crowd, right, in posing it for both of you. And if I could start with Craig, I'd be appreciative. We have a new presidential administration. And the new presidential administration has made various changes involving natural resources law and policy, environmental law and policy, energy law and policy, right? Does the new administration's, the shift in administration, the new administration's coming on, affect your level of optimism in our collective ability to address these challenging issues associated with Colorado River management? Implementing the Colorado River Compact, given climate change, et cetera. Do you have thoughts on the impacts on your optimism of the new presidential administration as far as the ability to address Colorado River management issues?
In the immediate sense, yes, it decreases my optimism, but I guess I always look outside of that. I'm going, okay, what is the response to this? And what will it look like in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? So I'm always pushing out to a longer time frame. And you know, in a way, my optimism hasn't really changed, because I think, no, we're gonna keep pushing and pulling. There's gonna be a lot of friction and tension, and this may even speed up our reckoning. In ways, this makes me more optimistic, because I think, oh, I felt this when the water in the reservoir, Lake Powell, was getting close to the penstocks. There was a sense of pessimism there, but I thought, oh, this is going to get us moving. Like this is really going to push things. And when we get a big snowpack the next year, and the reservoir levels rose, part of me was going, damn, you know, we got saved by the bell for a moment, and I think it's when we're not saved by the bell that we're going to get things done. And so even though I feel today, this week, this month, not optimistic at all, I feel like the current administration is a much harder pressure. There's much more at stake, and the optimistic side of me says, oh, we're going to make this happen. We're going to gather together and figure this out. But I live under a rock. What do I know?
Thank you for asking this question. I have some thoughts. One of them, and I'm quoting with permission from a Washoe Indian friend he and I were talking about things that weren't going well. And I said to him, would these things change in the foreseeable future? And we both said, well, probably not. And then we both said, what in God's name is the foreseeable future? When did I ever foresee the future? So we just, my friend Patrick Burt, whose scholarship you want to keep track of, but he and I just said, okay, that's what we're doing. We're not saying foreseeable future anymore. We're always going to say unforeseeable future. And it does really open up potential and possibility on that. I guess I can't remember when we could really look to a president for grounded knowledge of the Colorado River Compact. Where was I? I'm sure that a Secretary of the Interior tried. I'm sure Bruce Babbitt tried. I'm sure all sorts of people tried, but I don't know that we ever could say, oh, the president's really got this down, for good or ill. So with this president, I think my first thought is there's a really good strategy for avoiding trouble here, which is to say, this is really boring. Really boring. Acre feet, you're going to talk about acre feet, and you're going to get on the news cycle with talking about acre feet? I don't think so. So if you just do this is so boring, and it's so tedious, and there's so many details, and it's just not worth your time, and distract him. I'm not sure what we throw in the path, but just don't just really basically say, pay no attention to this because it's just not the kind of thing that works for you. So not having his attention can be a very great blessing. And I guess that's what I would say, because it is boring sometimes. Not today, not tomorrow. But enough acre feet in a PowerPoint, and I'm struggling. So, okay, so I think that's I believe I've solved the problem now, which is just to, just have everybody's set to make sure that he is always reminded that this is not of interest. And it will not get you, Fox News may cover the compact. I've never heard about that either, but just, oh, Mr. President, look over there. It's a little bit the reverse of the Wizard of Oz saying, pay no attention to the little man behind the screen. It's sort of, well, I don't know, let's not go there. Thank you. I have a funny story I would like to just quickly say. So Providence works in weird ways.
Okay.
So I have this nice water bottle. I meant to bring a water bottle this morning. I forgot to, so oh goodness, I get this water bottle. But what's so poignant, it makes me think, it's a little bit remarkable here. My favorite water bottle, which I had since for at least 11 years, I guess, it just stopped. Its plastic stem broke. Everything went wrong with it just like 2 days ago. So we're at a water conference, and I've just been redeemed with a new water bottle that is very cool and much nicer than the old one. So I just had to say thank you for the water bottle.
Well, thanks. We're problem solvers here, Patty. So, Patty, thank you both. I know people are going to, I know I'm going to run into someone next week that are going to say, oh, what did Patty and Craig talk about? And I'm going to say, I can send you the recording. Why don't I? They talked about all sorts of things, and it was really fun. But we are to the point of the schedule where we take a break. So we take long breaks, about a half hour, but we're going to start our next session right at 10:30 because we got a lot of people in our next session that you'll want to hear from. Our breaks are, all the food and stuff is next door. You probably figured that out already. When you bring stuff in, do it very sneakily so I don't see it, because that's how we do things here. And let's thank our speakers. To wrangle this group, we've drafted someone who has quite a bit of her own gravitas and wisdom, and that is Ann Castle. So let me introduce Ann very quickly. Most of you know Ann already from her days as Assistant Secretary for Water and Science at Interior, and more recently as the U.S. Commissioner and Chair of the Upper Colorado River Commission. She's also a Senior Fellow here at the Getches Wilkinson Center and the co-founder of the Initiative on Universal Access to Clean Water for Tribal Communities. So so again, I expect most of you know her from at least one of those roles. Ann's going to lead the group. I think she's going to start by making some remarks of her own, and then it's up to you. Who knows? Ann?
Thank you, Doug. And I'm also very excited about this panel. Not only do we have like a couple of centuries of experience and wisdom accumulated in this group, but they are all also very dear friends and colleagues. And I think we're going to learn a lot from this panel. In keeping with the theme of this conference, turning hindsight into foresight, this panel is all about that. What wisdom have we gained from the agreements that are expiring next year? And so to set that up, and the way this is going to work, I'm going to just talk about what are these expiring agreements that we're discussing in this panel. Then I'll introduce our panelists. Then they're each going to talk for 5 minutes-ish about the most compelling lessons that they've learned over the past 20 years of the agreements in place. And then we're going to have a more fulsome discussion. So what are these expiring agreements? Well, I think the people in this room are very well aware of them. We start with the Interim Guidelines in 2007, the first set of guidelines that provided for planned reductions in usage in the lower basin states, also balanced operations between Lake Powell and Lake Mead, provided for intentionally created surplus. We then move on to the minutes with Mexico, the first one in 2012 that mirrored reductions in the lower basin and provided for Mexico to take similar reductions at the same levels of elevation in Lake Mead. That was followed by Minute 323 that extended Minute 319 and also provided for further reductions in the event that the US states got together and also increased the reductions that they would be taking, which happened in 2019 with the drought contingency plans, and then followed in 2024, just last year, by the finalization of the supplemental EIS, providing for further reductions, and another minute with Mexico that again mirrors that additional recognition that we need to do more. So that's a very abbreviated timeline. There's lots of agreements in between. And I like this slide from the Bureau of Reclamation that shows the various different sets of agreements overlaid with the reservoir levels in Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And you can see how these things have evolved over time. You can see the sort of increasingly frantic rate of agreements occurring in the last 5 to 7 years because of the continued reduction in storage and the kind of hydrology that we were seeing. This slide is not complete. It doesn't show the supplemental emergency EIS. It doesn't show Minute 330. And it doesn't show the recovery of storage that we saw from the winter of 2023. But if we were showing that, the levels would, of course, go up and start to decline again. So we would be seeing the same pattern as we see in the rest of the 21st century. So the common features, I would say, of all of these agreements that we're going to be talking about today, cuts to lower basin deliveries based on elevations in Lake Mead, cuts to deliveries to Mexico, balancing of contents between Powell and Mead pursuant to the direction of the 1968 Act, and voluntary, temporary, and in some cases compensated water conservation throughout the basin. All of them expire next year, and they've all reduced water usage, but they haven't fully addressed the gap between supply and demand. So we know that we need to do more. So that is the expiring agreements in a nutshell. Let me introduce this great panel. Really, there's no better group of people to talk about lessons learned. And we're going to start with Jim Lockhead. Jim was previously the CEO of Denver Water, also the director of the Colorado Department of Natural Resources, a recognized expert in the law of the river. If you ever have a question that is a thorny question about the law of the river, people call Jim. Then we have Governor Stephen Roe Lewis from the Gila River Indian community. Governor Lewis is a really insightful and creative leader and has been responsible for some really innovative arrangements involving the community and the intersection of tribal water rights and water scarcity. Solar panels over irrigation canals, water conservation agreements with entities in the lower basin that have really been instrumental to allowing some of these agreements to go forward. Then we have Jennifer Pitt. Jennifer is the Colorado River Program Director for the Audubon Society and has a 25-year career in ecosystem restoration up and down the river and is particularly known for her leadership in the restoration of the Colorado River Delta. Lorelei Cloud is a member of the Southern Ute Indian tribe and has held various leadership positions within the tribe and tribal council. She is a co-founder of the Indigenous Women's Leadership Network and just recently was elected as the chair of the Colorado River Conservation Board. She has been the first Indigenous member of the CWCB and now is our chair. And I, sorry, skipped over Brad Udall. Yeah. Yay, Lorelei. Brad is a nationally recognized climate scientist who has particular expertise in aridification and Colorado River flows projected into the future. I would like to personally nominate Brad for being the successor to E.C. LaRue that Patty Libbert talked about. I think that would be totally appropriate. Bill Hazenkamp is the manager of Colorado River Resources for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. He has had a 35-year career in water supply management, and he's also the chair of the Colorado River Basin Salinity Control Forum. And finally, we have Mike Connor, who has maybe more than anybody direct hands-on experience in the issues that we're going to be talking about. He was the Commissioner of Reclamation for 5 years, Deputy Secretary of the Interior, and most recently, Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, which position oversees the Army Corps of Engineers. He's also, during his time at Interior, was deeply involved in discussions with Mexico. So again, very rich experience here. More detailed bios are available at the link in the program. Each of them is going to address the most compelling lessons that they've learned in their experience from these agreements that are expiring. So with that, we'll go right to Jim.
Thanks, Ann. Suddenly feeling a little old. Thanks for that. I appreciate that. I thought it might be useful to contrast some of the differences that I see in the current process that the states and the federal government are ongoing versus what the experience that we had, both process and substance, in the negotiations that led up to the finalization of the 2007 guidelines. So we don't have much time. I'm going to try and go a little bit quickly and outline some of those key differences. So first of all, regarding process. In the 2007 negotiations, the federal government was an active facilitator throughout the entire negotiation. They were in the room, they were talking to the states, they were going back and forth, they were doing shuttle diplomacy, they had engagement directly from the secretaries. In contrast, the federal government throughout this process has been more of a bit of wait and see, at least until recently, and has been more standoffish in terms of kind of deferring to the states. Secondly, in 2007, it was very clear that the states were not the decision makers. This was a federal process. The federal government was seeking and collaborating with the basin states and was looking for input, but the state's proposal was clearly going to be modified. And in fact, under Commissioner Bob Johnson, Secretaries Norton and Kempthorne, Reclamation actively collaborated with many others and incorporated many additional concepts in the 2007 guidelines from NGOs and others. In contrast, although there has been coordination with NGOs in particular and tribes in particular on the development of alternatives, there's been, I would characterize it as limited formal engagement from interior leadership in terms of collaborating with the parties in the development of a federal alternative. The third key difference in process that I see is that in 2007, key water users, contractors, districts, and municipalities were all in the room during the negotiations. The meetings often included over 50 people in the room. We had a small group that would be tasked with maybe coming up with proposals to the group, but having all those key stakeholders in the room allowed for real-time consultation and caucuses and advice to the principals in terms of the positions that were being negotiated. In contrast, the current process, to me, kind of feels like the conclave. We're waiting for the black smoke or the white smoke to come out of the 7-state negotiating room. And it's kind of ironic because in a May 19, 2020 letter from the basin states to reclamation, the state said, quote, accordingly, as the basin states begin the renegotiation as contemplated by the 7 states agreement, we envision a process that invites input and perspective from a broader group of stakeholders than that which occurred in the lead up to the adoption of the guidelines. Our prospects of success depend on working with those invested in the outcomes of effective river management. We encourage reclamation to keep the various water users, tribes, and NGOs, all of whom have played an increasingly prominent and collaborative role, informed. So as to substance, some of the key differences. First, in 2007, the states had disagreements about modeling, but they put those differences aside, and they agreed to have reclamation model proposed alternatives, recognizing that all models have flaws, models can't predict the future. All ideas were on the table, and reclamation literally produced hundreds of model runs at the request of various parties to test different ideas. In contrast, the states in the current process still can't agree on basic modeling assumptions. Second, with regard to substance, the 2007 process proceeded on parallel tracks to address basin-wide problems. Powell-Meade operations and lower basin flexibility in managing supplies both in-state and interstate were on the table. The discussions built on earlier discussions from the 1990s regarding concepts such as water banking, conservation savings, and interstate transfers. There was open discussion and argument over many concepts, and the states used large framework agreements to drill down into the details that eventually came to agreement. In contrast, rather than discussing basin-wide solutions, the 2 basins are stuck on separate proposals and are discussing separate operations. The 2 basins appear to be more focused on protecting positions as opposed to finding common solutions that will protect the basin as a whole. Again, ironically, the states began discussing basin-wide solutions back in 2013 through a process that they dubbed out of the box. Staff from both states and water users developed 2 possible scenarios to try and what we call bend the curve of Powell and Meade storage from declining to at least stable, if not increasing. They included some comments, some concepts that may seem familiar today. They included a lower basin reduction of up to 900,000 acre-feet of water by 2018, and they included upper basin variable yield, including monthly reoperation of Flaming Gorge when Powell was below 3550, and a system water bank when Powell was below 3575 of up to 200,000 acre-feet a year from the upper basin. Some of the conclusions and recommendations reached by that group included the idea that lower basin reductions would help Lake Meade, but not Lake Powell, that upper basin reductions would help Lake Powell, but not Lake Meade, but that basin-wide reductions would help both Lake Powell and Lake Meade. They also concluded that large volumes were needed to bend the curve. They recognized that no painless options were available, and they asserted that time to address the risk was short. The states quickly became stuck on those concepts, and out of frustration with the lack of progress, the municipalities stepped forward. Metropolitan Water District, Southern Nevada Water Authority, Central Arizona Project, and Denver Water teamed with Reclamation to self-fund the System Conservation Pilot Program to test the idea of temporary compensated and voluntary reductions in water use and demonstrate that it could be implemented throughout the basin. So these ideas have been on the table, sitting there for well over 12 years with no progress. Time is short, but perhaps the states can successfully develop an alternative by altering the process to include key outside parties, by agreeing on common modeling frameworks, and by revisiting basin-wide solutions.
Thank you, Jim. Very insightful. Governor Lewis.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Governor Stephen Roe Lewis. the Gila River Indian community. It's great to be here. I want to also recognize, I have our council member, Councilman Joe Manuel Jr., who's in the audience as well, and our treasurer Gary Mix as well. Great to see everyone, especially our tribal leaders here throughout the basin. Also, great to see Mr. John Echohawk, who is, of course, the executive director and founder of the Native American Rights Fund as well. Great to see you, John. Both he and my late father, Rod Lewis, they were that first wave of tribal attorneys back in the late 60s, early 70s. They're at the forefront of fighting for tribal sovereignty. And it looks like we come full circle. We're still having to fight for tribal sovereignty. And John is up to the task. He is a living treasure for Indian country. So I just wanted to say that just with the enormous amount of respect that I have for him. But I think what I want to cover on, I know that we have a limited amount of time, but I think as Ann covered, the agreements that we rely on to address the drought in the region, as we all know, right, they're expiring. And at the moment, we don't know what will replace them. A lot of discussion, but we still don't know. And we're, at certain points, I think we still have a lot of way to go of groundwork, to get there. By this time next year, we will need to know, though, what the new operating rules are in order to know how to plan for water use in 2027, a post-2026 world. So we don't have much time, and we don't have an agreement yet. So with that, I think what that does not mean, though, is that there has not been any progress. Some of the important lessons learned, I think, under the current agreements are likely and are influencing what is likely going to be in the new operating guidelines. Now, one of the lessons learned is that the department will need to be more engaged with tribes when implementing new operating rules. Under the 2007 interim guidelines, that was just discussed, the only consultation requirement that the department had was with the basin states, and tribes were an afterthought, despite the federal trust responsibility, the treaty trust responsibility to protect established tribal water rights. Tribes were not at the table. Now, this issue materialized during the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan discussions in Arizona. And the department has since recognized that the lack of early tribal engagement during that process was an oversight, and one I think they've learned not to be repeated. So importantly, what emerged from the DCP process in Arizona was a recognition by the department to heavily engage with tribes, willing to partner to help address the drought crisis. Now, the state of Arizona also came to see the important role tribes can play in reaching consensus within the state on these difficult issues. And as a result, under the Arizona Lower Basin DCP implementation plan, you had the Gila River Indian community and the Colorado River Indian tribes. I see, actually my aunt, the chairwoman of the Colorado River Indian tribes, Chairwoman Flores is here. And we see these two tribes commit to substantial amounts of conservation that helped Lake Mead elevations, if those of you that were in those negotiations and learned from those hopefully saw. You also saw other CAP tribes participate in system conservation as well. And importantly, in order to implement those DCP cuts within the Arizona Mitigation Plan, which was developed with all CAP water users getting some wet water mitigation from Central Arizona Project, ICS. But there was not enough ICS to fully mitigate everyone. And in order to get the deal done, the community agreed to take most of our mitigation through payments at a rate that is much lower than current system conservation rates, by the way. And it agreed also to some unmitigated cuts. But I think what's important to note, and this is my responsibility as the governor, is to tell and to articulate this, and I do this time and time again, without the community stepping up and agreeing to a plan on its terms, the Lower Basin DCP would not have been approved in Arizona. So our willingness to continue to come back to the table, to find solutions to those difficult problems and to continue to be open to partnerships with the department and the state of Arizona to make those additional commitments of conservation in addition to our DCP commitments. It's an example, and I think it's an important, I think it's a good practice of how tribal engagement results in positive outcomes that benefit not just the tribes itself, but benefit the entire region, the entire basin, that is. And I was just informed this morning, I'm looking at my team here. I was just informed this morning that by the end of 2026, through DCP cuts, system conservation, and intentionally created surplus, the community will have left over 1 million acre feet in Lake Mead. And that's such, I think, an important achievement for the community, that we are trying to do everything we can, not just, me, being on panels and talking, but it's actions. It's actions that actually move the needle toward a more sustainable future for all of us in the region. And I'm proud of our community. I'm proud of our council. I'm proud of our elders. I'm proud of our youth who are so supportive of this and so understanding, that the community is doing important, critical work in the basin. So again, and I share this not only as an example of what tribes can do, but also to demonstrate what others, more importantly, right, what others can do as well, especially those of you in the room here. So to my friends in the upper basin, if one tribe, and I'll leave this as I still have a few words to say, but to my tribes in the upper basin, I'm going to be direct. If one tribe in the lower basin can make this kind of commitment, so can you. And yes. And I'm happy to say that the positives that come out of more tribal engagement by the department and basin states have been learned, that many basin tribes are more engaged and that the basin states appreciate this engagement moving forward. So again, going forward, any new agreements will have to find a way to include tribes in decision-making as these agreements are implemented, especially those tribes that will be impacted by any of these decisions. Another lesson learned was that the storage and conservation tools authorized under the interim guidelines worked to help the lower basin avoid catastrophic drought impacts. And these tools should be built upon and improved upon and should also be included in the upper basin as well. Now, the community believes that storing water when water is available to create those pools, to offset cuts or create buffers, to protect those critical elevations and reservoirs will be an important tool needed to make the new agreements work moving forward. But that leads me to my last, I think, important lesson that I'll share with you. System conservation needed under the SEIS and much of the Arizona ICS creation under the DCP could not have been done, could not have happened without substantial federal funding. Now, our region will need additional federal funding and we'll need our congressional delegations to help press for this funding. But I know that we'll face skeptical senators and House members from other states, and I think that the days of large federal outlays of resources just for system conservation are over because there is no long-term benefit. Under the current system conservation program in the lower basin, a water user is paid to leave water in Lake Mead, but that water becomes, as we all know, system water, and is free to be used the following year, and that's not sustainable. So because this water is not protected, the benefits are short-term. But if the federal funds were being used to create pools to protect those critical elevations or to protect against those catastrophic cuts that could cause major damage to the region and our national economy, I believe Congress will be more receptive. Under this proposal, the conserved water is set aside and protected from future uses except for those specific public purposes. This provides a long-term benefit. And further, federal funds will be needed to help with infrastructure for those long-term conservation and water augmentation. And as a basin, we need to collectively find those ways to reduce inefficient water use, those practices, and support new water projects. And with regard to those water efficiency projects, the community is doing this now in real time. We have several federally funded projects that will further reduce our reliance on Colorado River water. And I recognize that private and state money will also be needed as well. But the scale of what needs to be done to secure the basin's future will require those substantial federal resources above what has already been provided. And I know we want to finish with our other statements, so I'll wait for the questions. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Governor. Jennifer, up to you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me back. I'm impressed that I'm on the old people panel now. And I guess I wanted to start with another just memory of Commissioner Roberto Salmon, who was Mexico's lead negotiator for both of the minutes. He passed away at the end of January. He was 71 years old. I think that's too young. He hadn't at all retired from work. He was the commissioner for SILA, for Mexico's International Boundary and Water Commission, from 2009 to 2020. And all of us who worked on those US-Mexico agreements got to work with him and got to know him. And he was very personable, warm person, and really helped demonstrate that building trust in a negotiation space very much is born out of personal relationships. And he had those personal relationships with pretty much all of us who worked on those. So I know Daryl mentioned him this morning, but I wanted to bring up his memory again and also just say that I think I saw in him someone who, when faced with a seemingly unsolvable challenge of, not enough water and trying to get to some kind of agreement with, in this case, like the sovereign of the United States, he's smart, like really all of our negotiators, I think, see the solution spaces. They're not dumb, but rather than pounding on the obstacles, he looked at the puzzle pieces and tried to find the side door in, as did many people involved in that negotiation. And so I like to think that he was one of the absolute key people in making those US-Mexico agreements work. And that's one lesson we can learn. Well, two lessons, the personal relationships and also looking for the side door, I think are worth remembering. I do have a couple of other thoughts about lessons learned from the past. One is, not to toot my own horn, but that lessons or ideas from non-state parties, from non-state stakeholders can be useful. And I say that as someone who spent many years helping to put together an alternative that was considered and analyzed in the NEPA process that led to the 07 guidelines. And that was a proposal called Conservation Before Shortage. It came from the NGOs and it broadened the scope of analysis for what was considered in that EIS in a way that ultimately opened the door for the US to have a negotiation with Mexico and include a component where Mexico could start storing conserved water in Lake Mead. But for Conservation Before Shortage, I'm not sure we would have gotten to that point. So we proved some utility, but the main point of Conservation Before Shortage was actually to point out that using prior appropriation to impose regulated water shortages on water users who are often junior is sometimes a really bad fit for that water user who has pretty much, nobody can say they cannot conserve anything, but has a much more limited ability to conserve water because it's less of an economic proposition and more of a human livelihoods proposition. Conservation Before Shortage was really focused on the idea that transactions for water conservation, providing dollars to users who willingly decide that those economic terms are right for them, was a way through. And at the time, that idea was summarily dismissed. And I would say that in the years since, we have seen that that is how the basin is operating. So maybe the lesson there is it didn't belong in the guidelines, but we said the thing out loud. And I would say that that is how we're operating at this point. And I would say, point out to you that, you know, perhaps the NGOs have again developed an alternative for consideration for the post-2026 guidelines that may show up in the NEPA analysis. It's called the Cooperative Conservation Alternative. And I think there are some ideas in there that are also useful. We are under no illusion that it is the answer to what we need for the Colorado River Basin, but I think there are elements in there that are worth consideration. And I guess my second lesson learned I wanted to point out is that sometimes it can help to change the decision space. You know, I think sometimes it helps to broaden it. Maybe sometimes it helps to narrow it. I'm not sure. But I would point out that when the US and Mexico started to work on what ultimately became Minute 319, what the US and the states really wanted was for Mexico to share in the shortages that had been defined in the 07 guidelines. But that's a tall order for another country that has a treaty that doesn't really define shortages other than talking about extraordinary drought. And I guarantee you that people on the Mexican side of the negotiating table at that time were pointing to our system and saying, are you sure that's extraordinary drought? It kind of looks like you over allocated your system and you're using too much water. So as a way to get past that, what we ended up doing was broadening the decision space so that there was more to talk about, and included in the discussions were the possibilities of binational investments in water conservation and binational cooperation to address habitat restoration in the Colorado River Delta, which is really what the NGOs brought to the table, and was fortunately part of what came out of those agreements. I think that ultimately, both the dollar investments that the US was able to make in infrastructure improvements in the Mexicali Valley, as well as the environmental component, helped Mexico ensure that it had a winning agreement to take home and show their stakeholders that also included taking on a share of Colorado River shortages. Broadening the scope of what we were talking about helped bring them to the table to do that hard thing. So I just think sometimes you have to look at things from a slightly different angle than the zero-sum perspective of we're just dividing up a bucket of water. And I'll just end quickly, not to take too much time, with this issue of people and relationships that matter, and the issue of trust, just to share a story from the days of negotiating Minute 319. There was a meeting in San Diego at some windowless conference room in a hotel. That's always where they were. And Reclamation came in and needed to explain that the Upper Basin had a new depletion schedule, and went through the explanation and the modeling, and Mexican side of the room looked at the results, saw that the shortages would increase as the depletion schedule showed accelerated development of water in the Upper Basin, and called a big caucus and spent hours talking through what they thought they were seeing, and really concerned that they were seeing the US changing the playing field before their eyes. And this caucus went on and on and on. And Jerry Zimmerman, who was at the time representing California, just was getting cranky and hungry, I guess. Anyway, the Mexicans are about to walk. They've ended their caucus and they're about to walk. But Jerry has ordered coffee and cookies. And The Mexican delegation, like gracious as ever, could not say no to an offer of a shared snack, and sat down and had coffee and cookies, and we started talking again, and the negotiations moved on. So sometimes it's those little things that actually, it's that humanity of sharing our circumstances as human beings in a windowless conference room that can get us to where we need to go. Thanks.
And the coffee, I assume, was brewed with Colorado River water.
San Diego, probably.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Brad.
So good morning all. Doug, Daryl, Jason, thanks for having me again. Given the policy expertise on this panel, I'm going to constrain my remarks to what's going on in the climate space, as maybe is obvious. And I want to make the following 2 points and end with a heartfelt plea. So within this basin, we can and have worked together to deal with a really sticky, difficult issue like climate change to inform decision-making, given the right partners, including the federal government at the table. And point 2 is our climate current trajectory is beyond awful. And that makes our challenge even worse. So let me get to point 1. We can, in fact, work together on a really difficult issue. So in late 2006, Terry Fulp pulled together 6 different scientists to consider how a changing climate would impact runoff to inform the 2007 Interim Guidelines EIS. That effort became Appendix U, and interestingly, it was the first time climate science was incorporated in a major EIS. It was really not particularly controversial, and it was done during a Republican administration. And it set the stage for future reclamation climate change efforts that have continued to this day, but put an asterisk next to that. So the next year, the Water Utility Climate Alliance was formed from 8 major national water providers, and 4 of those were actually in our basin: San Diego, Denver, Metropolitan, and Southern Nevada. CAP later joined. Since then, WUCA members have led the way in figuring out how to adapt to climate change, including hiring certain staff to deal with this. And I'll hat tip to both Jim and Bill Hazenkamp for this. So in addition to the in-basin climate leadership, let me mention reclamation again, because in 2009, Mike Connor, as a congressional staffer, wrote the Secure Water Act, which made reclamation perform a series of continuing climate change studies that are important to this day. So the lesson here is that when faced with such a daunting and unknown challenge, we actually can come together to discover scientific truths, but we need both federal and in-basin leadership to make this happen. Unfortunately, right now, one leg of this is seriously threatened, hence my asterisk. So my second point is about our awful global climate change trajectory. Hold on to your seats, because I'm going to make you uncomfortable right now. The world is on track for 3 Celsius warming by 2100. This far exceeds anything agreed to by the 2015 Paris Climate Accords, and frankly, terrifies scientists. 3 Celsius is a projected average global warming, but over land, that's 5 Celsius. Converted into Fahrenheit, it's 9 Fahrenheit. Imagine every day 9 Fahrenheit warmer. Highs 9 Fahrenheit warmer, lows 9 Fahrenheit warmer. That's a world unlike anything we currently know, and it's going to challenge us all on every front. And what's worse about this, and not particularly appreciated, is that to get to 3 Celsius, we need large global greenhouse emissions to continue through this century to 2100. So it will continue to warm significantly beyond 2100. So 9 Fahrenheit's not where we end up, it's kind of where we start. This 3 Celsius outcome has been obvious for at least 5 years as climate policy progress has stalled and even gone backwards. You know, post-Paris in 2015, there were all kinds of great net zero by 2050 pledges by government and industry, including the fossil fuel industry. But since then, the fossil fuel industry is trying to have it both ways. They love to tout these goals while at the same time talking to the shareholders about how they're going to expand production in ways that are completely incompatible with 2 Celsius. And there are about 25 large, mostly national oil companies that are living this lie. Each one thinks they're going to be the last one standing selling a product that's fundamentally incompatible with a stable climate. If you think we got plenty of time to solve this, like 75 years, normally I'd agree with you, but think about what's happened over the past 35. Emissions have gone up 60% and continue to rise. With these bad actors and with banks willing to finance this and governments willing to subsidize it, what we're witnessing is a monumental failure of both capitalism and governance. And now, if this weren't all bad enough for you, we now have an anti-knowledge president and his vile enablers systematically attacking all forms of knowledge using illegal and unconstitutional tactics. And nowhere has this been more true than in this climate science space, where they're going after anything and everything that has the word climate on it. Every federal agency, and I'll mention 3 here in our basin that are really critical, NOAA, the USGS, and Reclamation, all of that climate work is in the sights of these vile enablers and the administration. Hence that nasty asterisk again. And this administration, he aims to stop all work at preventing future greenhouse gas emissions, as well as our ability to adapt to coming changes. And 95% of what I could say up on this panel about this is not suitable for this room, but let's call it what it is. It's insanity what they're doing. There are also recent strong signs that climate warming is speeding up. So 2023 and 2024 were 1.5 Celsius above a pre-industrial average. And those 2 years have a trend line that's twice what we're used to seeing, and it has climate scientists flummoxed about the reasons behind it. So why talk about global climate issues in a conference about the Colorado River? Well, it should be obvious. There is no way this makes for a better world in which we live, a better world in which the Colorado River flows. And if you live in that world, tell me how to join you in La La Land, because I'd love to be there. I'm now convinced that we need to plan for the worst possible climate future, and that's somewhere around 10 million acre-feet runoff. But what it also means is taking a hard look at every existing agreement in the river. It either breaks them or substantially modifies them. So let me get to my plea. These facts should be a call to action to everybody. Not only are we in a really deep climate hole, we're continuing to dig, and absolutely the last thing we need is the federal government undercutting our efforts to meet the water supply challenges in this basin. There's a term called the pessimism aversion trap. I'm going to urge you not to fall in that. And it's the tendency to look the other way when confronted with dark realities. We still control our destiny, even if the solutions seem daunting. So I'm going to ask for 2 things. One, obviously fight back against all these harmful cutbacks to all aspects of our national climate effort, including the abandonment of science and scientists. Our federal allies are critical partners in this fight, and lasting damage has been and is already being done. Second, some of you think that your job description doesn't include worrying about reducing greenhouse gas emissions or what might happen at 2100 or beyond. I disagree. I plead with you to get serious about figuring out how to reduce the emissions of your organization and even your own personal emissions. I agree that individual actions aren't going to solve this, but they send a really strong signal to everyone around us. So finally, I need to apologize to and beg forgiveness of our next speaker, who deserves to follow someone far nicer than me. I am thrilled that you're chairman now of the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and I look forward to hearing your remarks.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, AC, Brad. Over to Lorelei.
Thank you, and thank you, Brad. Thank you, everyone. First, I have a disclaimer, because I know in the program it says Lorelei Cloud Southern Ute Tribe. I do not represent the Southern Ute Tribe, nor do I represent any of the committees or organizations that I am affiliated with. I am representing myself, and I am free to speak as myself, so anything could happen. So, and I am the only one that can blame for any of the comments that I am going to say, because seriously, anything could happen on this panel. And I am very lucky to sit with the people here, because all of these, like Daryl said, he's got heroes, and my heroes are sitting here with me. And you know, when we talk about the lessons learned, I could speak more than 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, I've been given 5 minutes to talk. But let me start with the roles of tribes in shaping the implementation of the Colorado River policy, because there's little to no role for tribes in shaping that policy, not until the recent years. And we have seen the exclusion from the water rights decisions that has had lasting consequences for tribes and for the entire basin. And we've seen that particularly during COVID. We know that the lesson from that is that water governance must include Indigenous sovereignty from the beginning, and it shouldn't be an afterthought. And we've been an afterthought since colonization. And so we know that, and that's been a fact, and that's been talked about since the beginning of this conference. We also know that tribes have been fighting for decades for water that was theirs prior to colonization, and we're still fighting for that water. And we really shouldn't be doing that. I mean, it's 2025. Haven't we learned that lesson yet? And so we're still learning those lessons. And the past century has really shown that the exclusion of tribal voices has really led to this crisis that we're dealing with now in the basin. If we would have just honored the tribal sovereignty from years back, even from the beginning, we probably would have had serious offers that provided solutions to what we're dealing with now. We wouldn't be sitting here talking about hindsight to foresight. We would have been having probably a sustainable environment and not talking about a 3-degree increase, because it makes a big difference. When I think about what that impact is in my basin, we haven't had snow in the past few years like we've had when I was growing up. Climate change has very much impacted my basin and in my entire area, not just in where I live. And so those things matter. Words matter. Our actions matter. And so speaking of actions, tribes, when we talk about the compact, tribes were never consulted with the 1922 compact. Tribes were never consulted with the 1948 compact for the Upper Colorado River Commission. Tribes and both of those are basically key components to the law of the river. Tribes were never even consulted with the 2007 Interim Guidelines. So again, lessons needed to be learned. Tribes need to be in the room when those decisions are being made. That still is a lesson that we need to be learning today in 2025. Because even with the negotiations going on, it's only as a courtesy that tribes are in the room for some of those discussions. And I say some of those discussions. Again, a lesson we still have to learn today. So how do we change that? I think going forward, it's all about decolonizing the water management system that we are currently dealing with right now. And I don't know how many of you think about that, but really that system hasn't been working. The laws and regulations that are in place right now do not benefit tribes. They're meant to benefit everybody else. Because tribes were not supposed to exist in 2025. That's a system that we need to change. And as we've heard from our first speakers, the Native people know this river better than anybody else. And you know, there's been some progress that has happened in the past few years. You know, we've had the Bureau of Reclamation, the Tribal Information Exchange, which I think was going pretty well. We also had the Upper Basin Tribes and States dialogue, and we had came up with a mutual understanding. We're saying that we're going to continue to exchange information with each other and continue meeting. First of its kind. That just happened a few years ago. Out of over 100 years, that just happened. Tribes are finally being taken as a value. We also have some language in the DROA framework, actually in section 707.2, saying that they're going to consult with tribes when they're starting to discuss about the drought response program. It's taken over 100 years for tribes to be considered in any type of language in those documents. So again, there's been some progress, but nothing in the decision-making progress, in this decision-making management process. That, I think, needs to change. For me, tribes really need to have a direct voice in what is going on in that decision-making process. I think throughout this entire next 2 days, we're going to continue to hear that. And not to take up too much time, but I think just a couple of more points is tribes have been at a disadvantage for a really long time. And I know particularly the tribes in the upper basin, we have been living with less for such a long time. And people are okay with that, while other people are using more. I know I'm not okay with that. And again, sometimes tribes are asked to continue to use even more less. And we really need to think about what that is, because again, decolonizing that management process, that management style is really how we get to a sustainable solution, because it's about equity and sustainability in the end of the day. And for me, when we talk about tribal voices, it's time that tribal voices flow just as powerful in the rooms where decisions are made, like the water in the Colorado River. That has to happen. That has to be a lesson that we learn. And kind of going off of what Brad was saying and the state that we're in right now, honestly, I think if our state representatives are going to sit silent, then we have 30 tribal nations that are ready to take over and make a decision and save our river. We've been doing it since time immemorial. Our tribes need to step up and say something and take control back to where we were. Say the prayers, bring our river back, provide the water to everybody. Told you anything could happen. I think also that honestly, we need to be better with each other. When we talk about it was mentioned this morning again about the state lines and it's arbitrary lines that came in later. You know, tribes, we moved from place to place. That's true. We gave our land time to rejuvenate itself when we moved from place to place. We can't do that anymore. And so the people that are occupying those lands now, that's your responsibility now. So again, it's everybody's responsibility to do that for our land and for our water. It's not just up to the tribes anymore, it's for everybody. Those are, again, lessons, the hindsight to foresight. It's now everybody's responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorelei, for giving us your heartfelt remarks. Bill.
So I'm at a New Year's Eve party. It's December 31st, 2002. And we're watching along with Dick Clark, the giant ball fall, counting down the seconds. but I'm feeling a bit nervous and a bit queasy. I had just become the Colorado River manager for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. We provide water to 19 million people in Southern California, about half of it from the Colorado River, and about half of it from Northern California. And I knew that when that ball hit midnight, California will have missed a federal deadline. The federal government and the 6 states said California has to execute the quantification settlement agreement by midnight or your water will be cut off. We didn't know what to expect at that point, but Reclamation and Bennett Rayleigh acted quickly. And our approved water order had been 1.25 million acre feet. He slashed it to just over 500,000 acre feet overnight. And that slash became permanent. And that's enough water for 6 million Southern Californians was lost forever. So we scrambled in Southern California. What do? We eventually did sign the QSA, where San Diego County and Metropolitan committed to spend billions of dollars to partner with ag to have more efficiency so water can come into our region, but that would take decades to materialize. So what could we do now in 2003? Well, the thing about our system is that we have a highly variable state water project from the Sacramento River. In some years, it provides more water than we could possibly use or store. And in other years, it provides just a trickle of water, our own hydrologic shortage in California. So what we needed to do to live with this new reality is figure out a way to maximize our state water project deliveries in wet years in California and back off water, put it in Lake Mead so we could recover it in the dry years. Metropolitan alone had our own, we had the sole provision of being able to bank water in Lake Mead in our contract with Reclamation, but we were never able to implement it because of a dispute with Arizona. So when Secretary Norton told the states to come up with the new guidelines, we focused on getting the storage that we so badly needed in Lake Mead. And after discussions with Arizona that developed the intentionally created surplus program, which was consistent with the Arizona decree, the Supreme Court decree in Arizona versus California, the ICS program was born. And there's several types of ICS programs, but the one that we were focused on was the ability to leave water in Lake Mead in 1 year and pull it out in another year. And in 2007, California was the only state that was interested in that type of ICS, and then we were the only state that could do that. And that proved incredibly valuable for Southern California. We put a lot of water in the wet years and took a portion out in the dry years. We got through droughts in 2008, 2015, and most recently 21 and 22 with that storage. But as the guidelines progressed, conditions changed. And by the mid-teens, it was clear that the entire lower basin was exceeding its conservation amounts, and they needed a place to store water. So in the 2019 DCP, the ICS program was changed. It was expanded, and it also allowed Arizona and Nevada to start to participate. Quickly, the ICS program filled. The ICS storage amount's full, and as of today, that type of ICS is full at 2.7 million acre feet in Lake Mead. There's other types of ICS that's also in Lake Mead, but I'm talking about the type that you leave in 1 year and take out the next. There's been a lot of implications of that ICS. And Aaron Mead and Laura Lambden from Metropolitan back just completed a white paper to highlight exactly what were the implications of that ICS. It resulted in reduced shortages to Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico. It reduced releases from Lake Powell through balancing, so there's more water in Lake Powell today because of ICS, and of course there's more water in Lake Mead. So it incentivized conservation and did a lot of good. But there's also a downside, that now we have the Lake Mead, and the system owes 2.7 million acre feet of water that there's not a lot there. So we have to figure out in the new guidelines this huge debt that the system has, how it's going to be paid out. So those are the discussions that we need to have. But I would say that there were 3 lessons learned really from this storage program. One is storage works extremely well, certainly in the short term. There should be storage in both Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Incentivizing conservation provides tremendous benefits in the short run. And we heard from Governor Lewis earlier about in Arizona more recently. But secondly, we have to figure out a way that it's probably not good for a long-term storage forever. Maybe there's got to be some like a 457 plan. You have to start taking it out at age 70 or something. But recognizing that it makes the system look maybe a little bit better than it is. So maybe making it operation neutral or some other way to incentivize it, but also not have this future debt that we have to figure out how to pay. And the third thing is that California is somewhat unique in that we have a lot of opportunities for augmentation supplies in the future. We have tremendous ability to recycle water. We currently recycle 15% of all of Southern California's demands is met with water recycling. We have the potential to do more. And in fact, Metropolitan is pursuing the largest recycling project in the nation. San Diego is also pursuing some, Los Angeles. And we have an ocean. Very expensive to desalt water, but if we can have these pools allow other states to fund conservation, desalination, these more expensive programs that can provide multi-state benefits, these pools then could be used to transfer water around to other municipal entities in the state. So hopefully we can get there in these guidelines that while we're figuring out the big picture between the upper basin and lower basin, these tools that we've learned in the last guidelines are really helpful. And as the late Muhammad Ali says, if I view the world the same at 50 as I did at 20, I've wasted 30 years of my life. So let's not waste these 20 years and build on the good parts of the guidelines from 2007. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for those very specific recommendations. That's really helpful. And Mike, wrap us up.
Thanks, Ann. Appreciate the opportunity. Appreciate following all these great folks, great panelists, great insights. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here at my alma mater. It's particularly enriching for me, Getches Wilkinson Center, all those jobs that I got and had. I would have never had one of them if it wasn't for David Getches and Charles Wilkinson. So it's an honor to be here. I'll do anything to help focus on their memory and its value to this basin, to everybody, and to young people, students, everything. So hindsight's 2020, and we've had a good amount of time to be able to evaluate these agreements and what are the pearls of wisdom that we take from that. And we've heard a lot about the substance of those agreements. And, I don't think anybody could contest the fact that they have been valuable agreements, that they have forestalled what we know is the crisis that we've all been worried about over the past 20 years. And through those actions, through those agreements, we've pushed off that crisis. Brad has brought it to the forefront again. I almost felt like giving him my mic so he could just drop it at the end of his talk, but we wouldn't have heard otherwise, so forget that. So I just want to, rather than focus on the pearls of wisdom, I was lucky enough to be involved and in the room for a lot of the negotiations. And as we know all too well today, you don't get to those agreements unless you get through some very difficult negotiations. And each one of those agreements that Ann referenced had those moments. And there were certain aspects that I took away through those negotiating processes that I wanted to focus on and saying, what's the wisdom gained and what are those pearls that we can take forward as we try and get to the next generation of agreements. So that's my focus. First, I would just say, it's an easy one. It's an obvious one, but it's one that I'm not sure has played out in these particular most recent negotiations on the post-2026 guidelines, and that's seize the olive branches when they're extended in negotiations. And they come in direct ways and they come in indirect ways. My example, Minute 318, the predecessor to 19, they were kind of a package. We were in Mexicali, and Bob Snow has coined this as the Mexicali mistake. And we were sitting across the table having those very stiff negotiations with 100 people in the room, going through translators, the Mexican delegation speaking in Spanish, we spoke in English, and they were stiff and they were difficult. And we were talking about a fundamental principle. A number of us have debated what that was. It was either Mexico's willingness to entertain the idea of shortages as part of a framework deal, or it was water that could be provided to the Delta. Either way, both principles were fundamental to the deals in 318 and 319 overall. And we're having this stiff negotiation, and we ask the Mexican delegation about this, and we get the answer back, no, we're not willing to entertain that principle. It's like, you know, hush goes over the room, and we kind of quickly wrap up the meeting. And, you know, we didn't want to leave it there, so myself, my team, some state reps, we quickly went out and using the principle that Jennifer set out, Mexico will always entertain the idea of hospitality. So we invited Commissioner Salmon and Secretary Luevano to have a beer at the Mexicali Sports Bar down the street, and where we just sat down, and I didn't know either gentleman really well at that point in time. That's certainly changed over time. But we just asked, you know, this was a fundamental principle, and we had some build up to this meeting, and you rejected it out of hand. Where do we go from here? And they looked at us like, what are you, nuts? You know, we didn't say no. And so we had a fundamental misunderstanding, bad translation. And so that was the first olive branch, was the look on Commissioner Salmon's face like, you know, WTF, buddy. Second one was we changed the process, and I would say he changed the process. We went from big, stiff negotiations to his willingness to negotiate in English in smaller groups, and then to add folks, including state representatives, and to build trust. And when he did that, I mean, my reaction was, this guy's serious. This guy wants a deal. This guy will break some china. And that guy was the driving force behind those deals that we negotiated with Mexico. And that guy was a great, great friend over time. Second, critical, you've heard this already, Governor Lewis laid this out quite nicely. Jennifer laid it out too with respect to the NGOs, and those are my two examples. Critical, essential players are not always in the room in the negotiations, and quite often they're not. First example, minute 319, pulse flow. Absolutely critical aspect. The Calderon administration was very focused on the environmental aspects of minute 319. Their fixation grew into our fixation with the Obama administration. We were going to get that environmental piece of that deal, the pulse flow, but we would have never gotten it without the NGOs' participation. They're on the ground ears, working with their counterparts in Mexico, working with those counterparts who had better insights into the desires of the Calderon administration than we had in the negotiating room. And they weren't in the room when we were negotiating those aspects, but they were involved in a discussion every time we got out of the room, so we could share what had transpired, so they could share their discussions. We would have never got that deal done without the NGOs, notwithstanding their not being in the room. And then the same thing with Gila River. 2015, 2016, high level of activity in negotiating the drought contingency plan. We were very proud of the progress that we were making. There was a framework by the late 2016, and that framework reality check came when Governor Lewis came into my office with his team, and on behalf of Gila River and other tribes said, we're not on board. We don't support this. You're going to impact our rights through these deep cuts, and we're not going to support your process. And oh, by the way, you're our trustee. Can you remember that? And so we quickly pivoted. We did the first system conservation deal with Gila River at the end of the Obama administration, and we wrote a secretarial order that highlighted their role in the importance of an intra-Arizona DCP as part of the overall DCP process. And it not only demonstrated the importance of including players who needed to be in agreement, they were the solution set, as the governor outlined. Colorado River tribes are part of the solution set that helped bring that deal together and make the DCP work. So last item I'll just mention real quick, and it's from personal experience, and I don't mean to be lecturing to today's current negotiators, because quite frankly, it's more my own humbling experiences during the negotiation process. Some of that has been on a personal level, and some of it's just been generally humbling, but I think it's really, really important for everybody in the room negotiating to remember it's not about you. And my two examples on that are minute 32X. You know, we worked our tails off during the end of the Obama administration to get minute 32X, which became minute 33, in place. It was written, it was done, and we wanted that deal. And quite frankly, I wanted that deal. And I wanted it for Barack Obama, and I wanted it for Sally Jewell, and I wanted it for myself, quite frankly. There was a little bit of, you know, non-personal aspect of it. We didn't know how relations were going to play out with Mexico, so we didn't know if that deal was going to be able to get done if we didn't do it. So we, you know, pitched this to the states and got 6 on board, 1 outlier. Eventually, that 1 outlier state, you know, begrudgingly didn't object. So we went back to Mexico, and Sally was doing a great job of continuing to coordinate with the Mexico representatives. But at the end of the day, they said, no, thanks. We need to either have this deal with the new administration. If you think DC is a political place, it is all the time. It's hyper-political in a presidential transition. And so we learned that the hard way, but quite frankly, best thing in the world. Best thing in the world, the Trump administration that came in, they moved forward with that framework. They got the deal done. They owned it, and just shows the best thing for the river was the continuity and the ongoing relationship. So that's, you know, humbling experience number 1 that people should try and remember as they're negotiating. The next one is, I'll just leave it and leave all of you with using the words of my friend John Fleck, who, you know, wrote this little passage in Waters for Fighting Over, his book, and it just encompasses the fact that this is bigger than any of us in the negotiating room. John wrote, the pulse flow was a test of how much water would be needed for native plants to come back to life and populate the area. But as the water arrived at San Luis, and for weeks after, it became something more. The unusually dry riverbed past the town turned into a fiesta as children who had never seen the water here frolicked in a briefly flowing Rio Colorado. And at another deeper level, it demonstrated unprecedented international cooperation to achieve a goal once thought impossible. And I think that captures all the people in the room, the folks on the ground. I saw some of that reaction during the pulse flow. It's very moving. It was incredible to watch. And the ongoing relationships that were built from that have served us well over time and need to serve us for the next 20 and 30 years beyond. Thanks.
Well, I think we can easily recognize that we've gained a lot of wisdom from this panel. We had intended to go into some discussion questions, but I think it's time for us to move directly to the questions from the audience that Jason is curating for us. Oh, Celine, great.
Well, thank you, Anne. And in case you didn't hear earlier, I'm Celine Hawkins from the Nature Conservancy, and I have been looking at the questions in Slido and trying to hone them down to a few because we only have about 12 minutes. I'm going to combine a few questions. There's a lot of questions about whether it's time to get a neutral mediator, facilitator, or moderator into the discussions between the federal agencies and the states. I know that those are 3 different things, especially for those of us who are attorneys. What are your thoughts? And this can be to anyone.
Who wants to wade into that? Neutral negotiator or neutral facilitator? Mike?
Sure. I think Jim articulated this from the get-go. That has been the role that the federal government has historically played as It has interests, it has trust responsibility, but for the most part, it has neutrally advanced those interests, taking care of that. It tried to move the basin forward based on a foundation identified by the principals negotiating in the room. And I think that's still probably at this stage the right approach. And, I've got grave concerns about this administration, quite frankly, for a lot of the reasons that Brad identified. We understand this concept of stationarity. The scientists, in 2008 declared stationarity was dead. We can't manage the water in the future based on what we've known in the hydrology in the past because of climate change. Question is, with our governing institutions, is stationarity dead? Is the federal government going to continue to play the role that has historically played with respect to supporting the science necessary to us to understand those implications and forecast, the impacts of climate change? Is it going to support investments in conservation and infrastructure improvements that have sustained us over the past 25 years? Is it going to partner up with Mexico on mutually beneficial solutions that are necessary in this basin? And finally, is it going to support Indian water rights, which have been foundational and created the opportunity for tribes to bring solutions to the table as we all manage this system? If you listen to the White House rhetoric, its policies, its ideologies, its budgets, no. Fortunately, what we see is a Department of Interior getting more active now, that has a strategic plan that highlights the importance of water. And it has money. It has well over $1 billion left over from IRA and bill. And my sense, even seeing some recent announcements, is that Interior, maybe they can't talk about why they're doing it, but I see that starting to happen. So I'm hopeful that that will continue, because I think the federal government is the key mediator, facilitator, whatever you want to call it.
Anybody want to add to that? Bill?
Yeah, in 2002, as I mentioned, the California parties did not sign the QSA. There were consequences. But we got back to the table, and we did have a facilitator for the discussions. The state of California, Sacramento, assigned people, realizing how important it was for California to get the QSA done, wrangled the parties together, and 10 months later, we had an agreement. So left to our own devices, we might have never signed the QSA. So I do think we need some mediator, moderator. When you talk individually to individual states separately, people want to make a deal. People want to compromise. People want to collaborate. But in the room right now, it's more of a position base and standstill, and a good facilitator might help break the deadlock.
Okay. Celine?
All right, next up, and this is for Lorelei, but others can weigh in. What does decolonization of the water system look like?
My version would be having the indigenous, ecological, historical knowledge of tribes implemented in every single aspect of water policy. I think that's the basis of water policy. That's where it should start. It's understanding that the tribal history in what that is. Tribes have been here since time immemorial. We've been taking care of this water. We have a different relationship with nature, with water, with the land. And that really should have been the first part of taking water out of the system and sharing with anybody. That should have been where it started. And that should have been what was built in the foundation of that system.
Can I just add?
Jennifer,
if
please.
you look at the words of the compact, it says, we're not addressing the tribes, and it says, we're not addressing Mexico. And it actually says nothing about the environment. And I think, just to echo exactly what Lorelei said, like, those are challenges that we know we need to overcome. And hewing, it is not a solution to hew to those words. And I guess we have a big question about whether it can be adapted as it has been incrementally and maybe not fast enough over time, or whether it somehow fundamentally has to be blown up. And I think that's sort of in the middle of the negotiations right now, that question.
Let me just add one thing. I think it's important to know that I guess it's important for everybody to understand too. We know that water is alive, and we also know that our historical traditional knowledge is ingrained in that water because it's part of who we are as people. And so every single time you turn on that water, that historical knowledge is in that water. And so how you take care of that is up to you. If you misuse it, that's up to you. The repercussions from that, that's up to you. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, good, thank you. Another question?
All right, well, there's quite a few questions that I think on the face could look like people from the relative basins sniping at each other, but I think there's really a thread going on here, and I'm gonna try to pull it together to ask you a question. How do we make sense of the pressures that we're seeing on the system? What's your wisdom to share about the trade-offs we need to focus on? And can the basin thrive, particularly if we're looking at that future that Brad told us about today?
Who wants to tackle that one? Jim, you got some thoughts?
Well, you know, given what Brad laid out, do we have a choice? And to build on the previous comments, you look at the compact was originally designed in part to avoid the imposition of the doctrine of prior appropriation on the basin. Well, what we've done is we've layered prior appropriation on the system. The priorities between Central Arizona Project and California, the intrastate priorities within California, the intrastate priorities within Arizona, the assertions that the upper basin has a delivery obligation to the lower basin. In addition to looking at the native people's concept of water, we might also look at the acequia system of community and commonality, and the implications of the imposition of priorities on the Colorado River are a disaster. You're not going to cut off Metropolitan. You're not going to cut off Phoenix and Tucson. You're not going to cut off the Colorado Front Range. It's just unacceptable. So there's got to be a different solution. There's got to be a basin-wide solution. And for somehow the states, facilitated by the federal government, need to come to an agreement that benefits the basin as a whole.
Anyone else? You know, I will just add to that. Our state negotiators have really, really difficult jobs. And their commitment is to their constituents and to maximize their constituents' interests. And that makes it very difficult for them to compromise. But I think it is incumbent on all of us, all of these very knowledgeable people in this room, to give our negotiators some cover to compromise and let them know that we understand that there's less water in the system and we all have to use less. And that means that some of what we thought were our legal entitlements and what we had expectations about using in the future, that those have to be moderated. And I think all of us participate in that.
Last question. The generation that will face the consequences of your current decisions is not present on the panel. Who are you mentoring to carry on this work?
That's a question for everybody. Governor Lewis, what do you think about that?
Well, you know, when we talked about what do you say, the collective 100 years of knowledge, you know, in water, you know, and I think it would be a shame, you know, that you know, this knowledge should be put to incredibly a critical good use, and it needs to be passed on to the next generation. That's essentially, as my good friend Lorelei is saying, you know, is that, you know, our knowledge base, we owe it to this next generation to pass this on, you know, to make sure that what we are the incredible mistakes that have been made, some very tragic mistakes that have been made, excluding certain groups, such as tribes, that doesn't happen again. That we build upon, these past injustices. For the community, our water was outright stolen from us over 150 years ago, and we're still dealing with that generational trauma. And we have a moral imperative, all of us, we do. We have an individual, we have a collective as well. And I think those of you that are policymakers, that are attorneys, that are professors that are teaching in these hallowed, halls of higher institutions, each one of us have an important sacred responsibility, as my father would say, as John Eckelhog would say, we have a sacred responsibility to make sure that these actions that we build upon, some of these small incremental successes, but more often, some of the challenges and of the mistakes that we've made. We've made a lot of terrible mistakes, and to make sure that we do not perpetuate those, that we learn from those. That was ingrained for me as a child growing up. I spent some time living with my grandparents, and that's a very traditional, upbringing when you live, and it's a tremendous gift. And that was always told to me, is that you learn from those mistakes. That's something that I carry with me, even as governor.
Yes, Jennifer.
There's a saying that my friends in Mexico have taught to me, which is poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. And, when I first got to know the Colorado River Delta, and you can still, when we say restore the Colorado River Delta, we're talking about a tiny restoration effort on the emaciated river corridor that remains. It makes a difference, but we're not restoring that whole landscape. But what I wanted to say in terms of who I have gotten to know and share this experience with, in the early days of thinking about what to do about the Delta, I had just like 2 or 3 friends from Mexico, and we brainstormed up this thing and somehow convinced a lot of people to go along with us. But today, there are literally dozens and dozens of people, young Mexicans. They all have more education than I do, and they are out at work in the field, putting that Delta back onto the map. And they are doing it with joy and with appreciation for the fact that it is under a binational agreement. And I don't see them shaking their fists at the border. I see them appreciating that cooperation. So I'd say that these agreements can, they change things on the ground, and they change people. And I sincerely hope that we can continue that legacy.
That is a great place to end. So please join me in thanking this amazing panel.
All right. Thank you, panelists. All right, we are going to go to lunch, and it is served upstairs. You should know, however, that our lunchroom has seating for maybe 100 people, and you're more than 100 people. So I suggest you share and cooperate, but also I suggest you use the 2 overflow rooms that are next to the cafe upstairs. You can take food in there. You could take food outside if the storms haven't gotten here yet, so you could do that. Don't bring it back here, and reassemble at 1 o'clock. Thank you.